The young lady stood transfixed as the young man touched her tenderly. He looked at her tenderly and quietly whispered her name. He looked at her with a smile and admiration. Because he saw that she was beautiful, he said that he loved her very much. Persepp whispered his name with a tender smile. She was glad that she had finally achieved success. At that very moment, he grabbed her tightly and said that because of her beauty, other men were drawn to her like moths to a light. He said that he saw their admiring glances directed at her, and it seemed to him that he was cutting them down with a sacred sword. At that very moment, fear spread through the elderly young lady. She realized that she had rather failed. A moment later, she noticed a notification window in front of her where her intended responses were written. Having chosen a line, she said that if he found a way, he must speak, and she would follow him no matter what. The moment she gained his favor, Siegfried said with a satisfied look that he knew she would say something like that. At that very moment, she saw that he was completely disposed towards her. She was glad of this fact. Siegfried, with a predatory smile, told her that she should drink something, and then they would be together forever. She was furious because she didn't want to do it. She wanted to say no, but to her regret, she agreed to do so with a satisfied smile. At that very moment, the young man kissed her passionately. She was in shock as the poison spilled over her lips. She hoped that the young man would be different. She knew there was no happy ending for him. The autumn game everyone has been eagerly awaiting is Persepp in a Cage. Beautiful graphics and 5 charismatic main characters. But unfortunately, the game flopped immediately after its release. Because the plot was too dark and the game had endings that could hardly be called happy. But the main problem was the constant unexplained buggies. The game's dialogues and characters were mixed up, and saves were deleted. No one wanted to play it, except for one young lady. After an unsuccessful attempt to play the game, she decided to get some sleep. Unsuspecting, she fell asleep with lightning speed. But after some time, she was notified that the game was ready to launch, and at that very moment, her room was filled with a radiant bright light. After some time, she woke up screaming. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not understand where she was. But a moment later, she came to her senses and cursed the young hero. She was furious because he seemed like the kindest of all the heroes, but to her regret, he still poisoned her. Persepp was upset about what happened, because she was stuck in the game. She did a lot of things to get back to reality, but unfortunately, the main characters, namely psychopaths, killed her dozens of times. She really tried hard to get through their arches, and yet she died a cruel death every time. She was puzzled and confused, as she had gone through all the arches to the end, but for some reason found herself at the beginning of the path. She assumed that if she passed the last hero, she would be able to return back. Persepp was taken aback by fear, and wondered if she would have to die forever in the game. She was in shock, and wondered if she really had to die every time like a dog. But a moment later, she saw a notification window in front of her. She was informed that all male characters had been completed. She froze when she saw the secret mode being activated. She was shocked because now she could experience the arc of a real protagonist. Persepp froze in shock as she did not expect anything like this. She could replay all the completed arcs, or play the arc of the real main character. She was shocked because she realized that there was no word about it. She paused for a moment and wondered if she went through the real protagonist arc, she would be able to return back to her home. Persepp immediately shouted that she agreed, and they should notify her who the main character really was. But to her regret, she did not receive an answer to her question, and a moment later, she found herself in her room. Persepp was in a hurry and was looking for the notification window, as she didn't understand what was going on at all. But after a few seconds, she froze and was covered in horror, as she heard a familiar voice. The tattered clothes miraculously became neat, and the hair smoothed out. And she saw a familiar landscape and a hateful voice, and fear and horror immediately spread through her veins as the game began again. Turning around, she looked in horror at the maid who slowly entered the room. The maid asked the young lady if she was awake yet. At that very moment, she saw a new notification window with her dialogues. She asked the maid with a smile what had happened. A boring choice she had made hundreds of times. The maid informed the young lady that His Majesty Emperor Dietrich had ordered her to be brought. Persepp sighed heavily, as she had not expected anything else. Dietrich Emperor Tyrant Adaloy, and unfortunately, he was the first to be subdued, and he was the one who imprisoned her in the palace tower. Ella looked at the young lady with disdain, and asked if she really wanted to be punished again for being late. Persepp sighed and wondered if she had a choice now. She knew that some options led to certain death. Some time later, she came to an audience with the emperor. He looked at her intently, contempt in his eyes. Persepp froze for a moment, looking at the emperor. After a few seconds, she decided to greet him. He said with a grin that even though she had lost her title but was living in the palace, she still acted like a member of the imperial family. She was very angry because he himself brought her to the palace, and now he was unhappy. She understood that if he was so disgusted to see her, then he could kick her out, although she knew he wouldn't do it. He was a sickly and withdrawn prince, even though he was the legal heir. But the second son from the concubine received all the love of the emperor, and when the empress died of illness, he was left all alone in the palace. Unfortunately for him, he was alone for a long time. But one day, a young lady appeared before him. He was taken aback as she extended her hand to him and looked at him with a tender smile. She was born to a low-born concubine, a princess deprived of the emperor's attention. They were both lonely and so quickly became close. They played hide-and-seek while everyone was looking for them. They had a great time outside the castle, and soon the young lady became the closest person to the prince. But unfortunately, the young lady was not lucky in this life. One day, it turned out that she was not of imperial blood. At that moment, the young prince joyfully rushed into her room. But unfortunately, he froze when he saw such a sight. He did not even have time to say goodbye. After all, Precep was thrown out of the palace in a hurry, and they didn't even see each other. Prince Dietrich was shocked when he realized she was gone. The prince was furious as he realized that she had also abandoned him. He understood that she had gone to his younger brother like everyone else. He knew that his brother was loved more, so he assumed that she had also gone to him. But one day he staged a coup and destroyed his brother and his comrades. But there was one thing he did first after the murder. He ordered the soldiers to seize the lady and bring her to him on a spinning top. At the same moment, he looked at Precep with rage and ordered the soldiers to lock her up in the western tower of the palace. She now understood that it was love-hate, and no matter how much she explained to him about the misunderstanding with his brother, he did not want to hear anything. She wondered if she should settle the matter with a question, but she immediately dismissed the thought because she could not speak freely. In front of the main characters, her body became numb, and she could only utter phrases permitted by the system. Precep sighed heavily as she knew she just had to finish arguing with him quickly. Precep suddenly saw a notification window with her phrases. But as soon as she wanted to press B on her remark, something incomprehensible suddenly appeared before her eyes. She froze in shock as she saw the curse, and at that very moment, she wondered if such a choice was even possible. She was puzzled because she knew something was wrong, but she decided to choose another option because after cursing, she would be executed immediately. A moment later, the young lady told the emperor that his voice was unhealthy. The emperor was taken aback as he did not expect such a thing. Precep sighed heavily and said that as a child, he often got sick at this time of year. She apologized because she was just worried. Precep saw that she had managed to avoid the bad ending, but she wondered if everything was okay. At that very moment, the emperor pounced on the young defenseless lady. He looked at her with fury and asked if she was worried. The emperor was very angry with her and was burning with anger, looking straight into her eyes. Several times he asked her if she was worried about him. He shouted more advantageously that he didn't believe her words, especially if it is about caring for him. She was shocked and called him. She assumed she had made the wrong choice, but she noticed that he was attracted to her at that very moment. He pushed her away. She was shocked because she had never chosen this option, because she was afraid of dying. But now she saw that his favor had grown. Dietrich said with fury that she had betrayed him, and now she was trying to gain his trust with such cheap tricks. Precep called out to the emperor with a trembling voice, but he only looked at her with anger and said that tomorrow there would be a celebration in honor of the coronation. She was taken aback when she realized that this was the celebration of the emperor's coronation. This is the first fixed event in the game where all three male characters appear. The emperor informed her that those who knew of her existence would be present at the festivities, so she should also attend the festivities. He looked at her intently and asked what she thought about it. A moment later, she saw the notification window where her lines were, but again a new line appeared, which was not there before. Precep knew that options 2 and 3 would improve the location. An emperor who wishes to keep her locked up is unlikely to welcome her presence. She knew that the last option was her certain death. At that very moment, she informed the emperor that she would also like to be present. Precep, looking at the emperor, asked him to allow her to be present at the celebration. He was taken aback as he did not expect such a thing, but he still allowed her to be present because he knew she needed to interact with other people. Precep froze in shock as she didn't understand what was going on. She knew that the outcome of the choice was different from the usual continuation, and in the normal mode, he would have driven her away without hesitation. A moment later, she was informed that replaying the game as a male character after viewing the hidden ending would reveal secrets that were not possible in normal mode. She was puzzled, as she did not know what secrets were being discussed. But at that very moment, the Emperor said that no matter what she did, nothing would change. A few minutes later, the young lady left his presence. She was confused and didn't understand what was going on at all. She didn't understand what kind of golden choice option she saw. She wondered if the plot could really change. Perseppe noticed that even the Emperor's lines had changed, and she realized that other characters would also change in the secret mode. Perseppe sighed heavily as she remembered the other characters. She had already met the first main character, Dietrich, who killed her. Perseppe still has 4 main characters to meet, namely Noah, Ivan Siegfried, and Attar, Duke of the North. Noah Dvern, a handsome young man in appearance. But in fact, he was a scoundrel who treated people like exhibits. Under the pretext of collecting art, he locked her in a warehouse. And when he got bored, he simply abandoned her there. The great and wonderful magician from all sides. Perseppe Ivan. Ivan wanted her to depend only on him. He manipulated her mind and drove her crazy. Perseppe sighed heavily, for she knew that he was the most terrible of them all. There was also a wonderful knight commander, Siegfried. Although she thought he was in his right mind, it turned out that he was not, because he wanted her to always be his. And at the same time, he forced her to drink poison. And the last Otter prince neighboring empires. He had rare and beautiful hair color. He was also noble and presentable. But unfortunately, the young lady was deceived by his handsome appearance at the party. To her regret, lost in thought, she tripped and fell. But at that very moment, she was taken aback as she heard the familiar voice of a young man. Attar looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and asked if she was okay. At that very moment, she saw that Arar Hanan's location was 0. She was shocked because she didn't expect this. Perseppe understood perfectly well that the young man appeared very early, because according to the plot, they were supposed to meet only at the celebration. She was taken aback and wondered if this was a mistake. At that very moment, the young man slowly took the shoe and began to put it on her. He noticed that she was very scared, so he asked for forgiveness with tenderness in his voice. She was taken aback, and fear spread through her veins. She remembered how he had tormented her with pleasure. He locked her in cages like an animal, and admiringly said that it was magnificent. Perseppe was furious as these memories disgusted her. She knew she had to quickly click something to get away from him. At that very moment, she was informed that if she didn't make a choice within the allotted time, the game would be abandoned. Perseppe was shocked as she understood that nothing like this had ever happened before. Perseppe was taken aback as her hand slipped and she chose a completely different option. At that very moment, she approached the young man and asked if he was okay. Attar was taken aback for a moment, as he did not expect such a thing. Attar froze for a moment and looked at the young lady in surprise. Perseppe was shocked and did not understand what to do in this situation. She was puzzled as she saw his dark and predatory gaze. Perseppe looked at him with fear because she did not understand what was wrong with his sympathy towards her. A moment later, the knight informed his master that it was time for them to go. He told the knight that he could go on his own for now. Attar approached the young lady. She screamed in fright that she had accidentally pressed the wrong button. But after a few seconds, she froze and looked into his eyes in surprise. She was in shock because she could speak. Perseppe didn't understand how and what had happened, because no matter how hard she tried, she could only utter systemic phrases in front of the main characters. Attar walked closer to the young lady and called out to her, reaching for her face as he did so. But at that very moment, she tore her exquisite outfit. She was shocked because she noticed that her dress was not recovering. She knew that usually it would immediately return to its original state. He sighed heavily and told the young lady that she had better leave. He reached out to her as if he wanted to accompany her. But at that very moment, she pushed him away with a scream. As she ran away, she shouted that she could handle it herself. And at the same time, she asked for forgiveness for her inappropriate behavior. He froze without saying a word while staring intently after her. But a moment later, he looked after her with a predatory grin, because he knew that he had something very interesting for her. But at that very moment, he screamed because he suddenly had a severe headache. A few seconds later, he saw some vague vision of a young girl sitting on a chain and crying. She said that she was in great pain and begged him to let her go. The young man froze for a moment in shock. He did not understand what had happened or what he had seen. At the same time, someone was watching him closely from a distance. A few minutes later, the young lady returned to her room. She was a little puzzled, seeing that her outfit remained torn, As soon as she clicked on that option, the system stopped loading the information. Perseppe was very excited and hoped that the save was still working. She could act so boldly only because there was a chance to survive. Perseppe was very worried that the game might be over. She was worried that her death might be final. At that very moment, she screamed angrily and ordered the system to save all her actions. But she was taken aback when she saw a notification that the save function was unavailable in secret mode. Perseppe froze in shock, as she did not expect to see anything like this. Essentially, she was being offered a choice. But now that there was no turning back, she had to either go through the known ending, repeat it endlessly, or risk your life in search of the real protagonist. She was confused and angry because she didn't know what to do since she had no clues. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she saw a notification window asking her if she wanted to activate the new secret mode feature. She looked at the notification window in bewilderment, as there had never been anything like this before, but she still decided to activate it. At that very moment, she saw the incident log in front of her. She was informed that the journal could be used to view the normal mode records. She read that the incident log also records new information about characters discovered in secret mode. At that very moment, she shouted that she would like to see information about the real protagonist. But unfortunately, this was impossible. Perseppe was angry, as she had hoped for the opposite. After a few seconds, she saw that she could open the incident log and look at past memories using the Book of Memories. When looking through the Book of Memories, she now had access to functions not only in the Western Tower. She saw information about the characters she was trying to conquer. With this information, she could get a hint. Perseppe wondered if she could use the system more freely. But when she wanted a hint about the real protagonist, she was asked to enter a password. She was notified and asked to enter the main character's real name, and then she would receive the information. Perseppe: "Unfortunately, I didn't find out anything, but I wanted to look at the Book of Memories." She was puzzled because she knew she had to find some way to find out the name. But a moment later, she froze in shock when she saw new notifications. Perseppe saw that the Book of Remembrance was open, but unfortunately, she could not see anything. Perseppe looked at the Book of Memories, which was open, but nothing appeared. At that very moment, she decided to open the event log. Perseppe stared at the magazine as it slowly loaded. But at that very moment, a shudder ran through her, and she froze in place from shock. Perseppe downloaded information about Attar, but suddenly saw some strange symbols. At that very moment, she saw that she had downloaded more past memories. She looked intently at scenes from her past life. Perseppe had seen these scenes many times in her previous adventures. She was puzzled because she remembered all the moments perfectly, and some of them caused her great pain. Perseppe was taken aback, looking through all the familiar scenes. She was puzzled because she did not understand why the young man's face was not visible. At that very moment, she screamed as she wanted to look at all the other heroes. She was shocked because she knew that everyone could be seen normally, except Attar. She froze as she realized that her previous answer had changed everything. Perseppe didn't understand what had happened to the young man. She wondered if it had anything to do with the fact that the Book of Memories wouldn't open. No matter how much she thought about it, she couldn't find the answer, so she soon went to the party. Perseppe entered the hall slowly, but she was determined to find the young man, because she assumed that in that case, the real protagonist would appear soon. Perseppe Pristelnaya watched everyone in the hall. She was very puzzled because looking around, she did not see the sympathy scale. Perseppe realized that most likely the real protagonist never came. But the young lady knew that she, unfortunately, had no time left. She turned around with lightning speed and left the hall because she knew that the next event had already begun. In a hurry, the young lady went outside into the garden. Perseppe was excited because she knew that now the most important part of the event would come, namely, the first meeting with the main characters. First in the garden, she met with Attar, and there they exchanged greetings. On her way back, she was supposed to run into Noah at the palace. On Dietrich's orders, Siegfried takes her to the tower, and that's where the events end. She knew that a young man would appear soon, but she was worried and wondered if he would show up as usual. At that very moment, she turned around and looked at the young man in confusion, as she did not expect to see him. Noah looked at her with a smile and asked what she was doing alone in the garden. "Perseppe, looking at the young man, I saw that my sympathy for him was zero." She smiled and greeted him, but she was nervous because she didn't understand why she had met him. Noah smiled and said that it was a great honor for him to meet her, as he had many questions for her. She saw his red hair, his handsome face, and knew it was no wonder everyone was losing their minds. That's what she thought until she found out what a psycho he was. Perseppe was surprised and did not understand what he wanted to talk to her about, so she said with a smile that she was very surprised that he knew about her. Noah said with a smile that she spoke very modestly about herself, since among those who had been to the palace, there was no one who did not know about her. He smiled and said that he loved everything beautiful, so he was especially curious to get to know her. He smiled and said he was wondering if she really was the piece of art everyone said she was. Noah said with a fierce grin that he thought he understood where such rumors came from. She was furious because she knew he was just a pervert, but she said with a smile that she didn't quite understand what he was talking about. He said that she went out to get some fresh air, so he wanted to keep her company. But at that very moment, the young man said that she would go for a walk with him. Noah looked at the prince with a predatory smile. Attar in turn looked menacingly and furiously at the young man. And at that very moment, he said that he would take care of the young lady himself, so he should leave. Attar was burning with rage and did not understand how the pathetic nobleman dared to contradict him. Noah bowed and said that he had no intention of doing anything like that. He told the young lady with a smile that he hoped to meet her. A few seconds later, he left their company. Principe Pugano did not understand why the prince appeared at such a moment. The prince turned around and told the girl that she was not just another noble lady, for he had heard that she had lost her title of princess due to her mother's infidelity. The prince looked at her intently and said that he would like to talk to her, as he had several questions for her. The prince came closer to her and called her the young lady froze in a daze. A moment later, the prince asked if they knew each other. Persephone froze for a moment, and fear coursed through her veins. He looked at her intently and asked again if they had met before. Persephone froze, not knowing what to answer, but judging by her reaction, he realized that he probably hadn't gone completely crazy. Recently, memories from the past came flooding back to him, and he was confused and didn't understand what was happening. He looked at the young lady with pleasure and told her to look at the beautiful shackles. Attar was puzzled because he did not understand what he saw in the establishment. The prince thought he must have just gone mad, but he knew the introduction couldn't be that real. He didn't understand what kind of memories he saw. He didn't understand why the young lady already had shackles that he hadn't yet had time to put on. Persephone was in shock. She didn't understand what he was talking about. She understood that everything had changed because she could speak freely in front of him. Persephone saw that his manner of speech had changed, and now he was no longer just a character with prepared lines. He looked at her with fury and said that apparently she did not intend to speak. Then he would make her say everything. At that very moment, he grabbed her. The prince looked at her intently and said menacingly that if he repeated everything as in that memory, she would speak. Persephone was taken aback when she saw the shackles in his hands. Trembling with fear, she screamed and asked him to stop. But he still managed to reach her and began to put shackles on her beautiful wrists. Persephone did not want this to happen to her again, so she hit him angrily and he screamed. At that very moment, she angrily slapped him across the face. The prince was shocked and did not understand what she had done. He froze for a moment when he saw her expression filled with tears. He saw that she was trembling with fear. Persephone turned around and at that very moment ran away from him. The prince shouted after her, but it was all in vain. He looked after her with fury as she ran away from him. He understood that something was wrong with her. The prince knew that there was still plenty of time, so he was determined to make her confess everything. He wanted to use any means possible against her to make her reveal the truth to him. But after a few seconds, he was taken aback and turned around as he heard someone's footsteps. He stood frozen in shock when he saw the young man in front of him. At the same time, the young lady stopped after a long run. She was in shock and didn't understand anything. She didn't know when everything went wrong. She understood that a mistake in the system had freed the young man, and thus he had regained consciousness. She was worried that others would begin to remember the same things as he did. She was worried that other characters might develop self-awareness. She was scared and confused because she knew she couldn't save herself, and if things went wrong, she could be killed again. The young man screamed in horror because he saw something very terrible. He screamed that the prince had been killed. Persephone froze in shock when she heard such words. Some time later, everyone clearly saw the prince, who was brutally murdered with his beloved shackles. Persephone froze in shock, unable to understand how something like this could happen. A wave of horror washed over her, as she did not know who could do something like this. She was immersed in her thoughts, and at the same time trembled from such a sight. She did not hear anyone around her. At that very moment, a flood of horror washed over her when she heard that the emperor had arrived. The emperor told the knight to immediately close all entrances and exits from the palace, and he also ordered a list to be made of everyone who left the banquet hall. He looked closely at the young lady and asked why she was in this place. He shouted angrily at her to answer immediately what she was doing. She froze in shock. The emperor shouted at her with fury as if he was expecting an answer. The knight looked at the emperor and said that the young lady was greatly shocked. At that very moment, the temperature turned around and told the knight to shut up since he had not asked him. He burst out in anger and fury. A few seconds later, the young people turned around as they heard the knight's voice. The young man looked at them intently and said that he would like to intervene in their conversation. Precep froze for a moment and looked at the young man in surprise. The emperor looked intently at Archduke Fenrik and said that he was late. Precep looked at the young man in surprise as she was seeing him for the first time. The Archduke apologized for being late as he had been delayed while checking out a suspicious situation. She flinched when he looked at her. The young lady remained silent and looked at him in surprise. At that moment, he simply nodded his head in greeting. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand his reaction. The Archduke informed the emperor that the prince's knight was looking for him. The Archduke looked at the prince's body and informed the emperor that they could not show him to them in such a state. The emperor frowned for a moment. At that very moment, he ordered the knights to bring the captain of the knights. The emperor also ordered the young man to take the lady to the tower on a spinning top. He angrily told the Archduke to make sure she got inside. Fenrik looked closely at the young lady and asked her to follow him. She froze for a moment, looking straight into his eyes. But still, after a few seconds, she silently followed him. At this, the Archduke stepped on the prince's hand with cold fury. For some time, they walked silently towards the tower, without saying a word. Fenrik sighed heavily and told the young lady that she must be very frightened by what had happened. He told her that the incident given to her looked like the work of assassins, since such events were ideal for local assassination attempts. He sighed heavily and said that the prince was only fourth in line to the throne, so the empire would not spoil relations with them because of someone like the prince. The Archduke turned and, looking at the young lady, said that everything would be resolved quietly, so she did not need to worry. She froze for a moment and looked at him intently as he had never appeared in her path before. She saw an unfamiliar face and scales before her. The location was visible. She was taken aback and wondered if he was really a minor character, as he was incredibly handsome. Unfortunately, the young lady was so deep in thought that she didn't notice how she stumbled, but he managed to catch her. The Archduke looked closely at the young lady and quietly and tenderly asked if she was okay. Precep thanked him for catching her. Precep was taken aback and wondered if he could really speak. She knew that even though he was a minor character, no answer options appeared. Precep was puzzled and wondered if you could really act freely in the intervals between main events. He looked at her intently and, sighing heavily, said that it was very good that she could still speak. He was glad that they could communicate freely. Precep was confused and did not know what to answer. At that very moment, she asked if they had met before, but she apologized as she was seeing him for the first time. He froze in place, not knowing what to answer. He sighed heavily when he heard her say that they were meeting for the first time. He knew that even though he was close to His Majesty, he spent all his time on the battlefield, so there was no possibility of meeting. She sighed heavily as she was about to close the Emperor's arch, and therefore they should not see each other anymore. He looked at her intently and said that there was nothing wrong with it. She looked at him in surprise, but at that very moment, he informed her that she would soon learn a lot, since they would be seeing each other often. For some time, the young man stood near the tower and watched the young lady intently. He was glad that he had reached his goal. At the same time, the young lady was stunned seeing in him as she was informed that the prince no longer existed. Precep was in shock and understood that this simply could not be because she had never seen anything like this before. But now she saw that the prince had disappeared. Precep looked around because she saw that everything was normal with the others. Precep thought for a moment about everything that had happened. Precep decided to look up information about the Archduke. But at that very moment, she was taken aback as she saw that such a character did not exist. A moment later, she decided to reveal information about the rest of the supporting characters. Precep didn't even understand what was going on. She didn't understand how this was possible, and so she wondered who he really was. He scared her very much, and his intense gaze made her feel uneasy. When she asked him earlier what he was talking about, he said that she didn't need to know everything, and that she would soon learn a lot about everything. Her gaze frightened her and pierced her to the tips of her fingers. She didn't know what to do in this situation. Precep opened her eyes and was taken aback when she saw her apartment. She wondered if she was hallucinating, She was so happy when she returned and saw the computer monitor on which the game splash screen was visible. She turned everything off with a smile as she realized that she had returned back. She understood that she had just had a dream because she could not get into the game. She knew it was really impossible, but when she went to the mirror, she saw her reflection from the game. A flood of horror washed over her. She was shocked and simply did not understand what was happening at all. Perseppe was hysterical because she didn't understand what was happening, and she didn't know her real name. She saw a young man who, with a fierce grin, said that she would never escape. At that very moment, she heard someone's voice, so she managed to open her eyes, which were filled with tears. She saw the emperor, who was looking at her with horror. Perseppe looked around and wondered if she had just had a bad dream. The emperor sighed heavily and looked at her intently while he called her, but she did not answer and only continued to cry silently. At that very moment, he stood up and asked her to wipe away her tears, as he wanted her to get up, because he needed to find out something from her. Perseppe looked at the emperor in surprise, confused. The emperor said angrily that Noah had told him something, so the emperor wanted to know what she had done with the prince of the university garden yesterday. Perseppe. At that very moment, I saw all the answers, but they were all golden.
She sighed heavily and said that she went into the garden to get some fresh air, but Lord Noah stopped her.
Perseppe said that then the prince suddenly appeared and sent the Lord away. After collecting her thoughts, she calmly said that the prince wanted to do something strange to her, so she hit him and ran away. The emperor froze in place, furious after she told him the news. He told her to immediately explain what exactly the prince wanted to do to her. She said that the shackles that were on the corpse's neck, he wanted to put them on her by force, and after she escaped from him, she heard that the prince was dead. Perseppe sighed heavily and said that she was surprised, so she went back. At that very moment, she saw that his sympathy had changed. Perseppe froze and wondered if this meant she would no longer see options in their dialogue with him. She was worried that he could see his memories and even the truth about who killed her. Dietrich looked at her with fury and said that she had better not lie and tell the truth. She sighed heavily but said nothing. As he left, the emperor said that she should not even think about doing something, and he also said that he would question the Lord again. A moment later, he stopped and said he never would have thought she was the type to punch a man in the face. He realized that in front of him, she acted like a lifeless doll. She froze in shock when she heard his words. Perseppe looked after him with bewilderment because she did not understand what had happened at all, and she had the feeling that he was offended. She was taken aback for a moment as she remembered her strange dream. She didn't know what it was about and thought it was just a nightmare. She remembered her real name, but she didn't know what she needed to make sure of. The only thing she remembered was that she just wanted to play a game. She didn't remember what she had done before. She was puzzled because, unfortunately, she couldn't remember anything. Perseppe was confused because she could not remember her life in real time. Noah looked at the Duke with bewilderment and said that he had not expected him to come to him after a long journey. The Duke, in turn, looked intently at the Lord but did not answer. Some time later, they drank tea in silence. Noah understood that the Duke had come to him because he was investigating the death of the prince. But he was puzzled as several minutes had already passed, and they were only silently sipping tea. Noah asked the Duke with a smile if the tea was to his taste, since it was made from rare tea leaves that were brought from the north. The young man was taken aback, as he had not expected such a thing. He said that it was a great honor for him that the Duke had tried it. At that very moment, he told the Duke that he had said something many words about him. The Duke looked at him with a predatory grin and said that he was even interested in what he was talking about. He knew that only the worst things had ever been said about him, and now he wondered what the Lord had heard about him. The young man was taken aback. The Duke wondered if the Lord had heard that he was a bloodthirsty monster who had cut people to pieces on the battlefield. Or perhaps he was considered unborn, without any respect for the nobility or members of the imperial family. Did the Lord consider him a monster? Noah looked intently at the Duke, not knowing what to answer. But a moment later, he smiled and said that it was simply proof of his unrivaled swordsmanship. The Duke sighed heavily and asked to stop with the empty chatter because he wanted to talk about the prince. The Lord said that he had already told the emperor everything he knew, for he had met the prince and lady in the garden at a banquet after which he had left. The Duke sighed heavily, and at that very moment, the Lord said that something strange had happened. Noah said he thought the lady and the prince already knew each other. He said he didn't know what was going on, but he felt like something had happened between them. Fenric looked at the Lord with suppressed rage and asked if he really believed that the lady was involved in the prince's death. The young man was taken aback and said that this was not so, and that it was just his opinion, and he understood that this was the work of murderers. For a moment, there was dead silence between them. Fenric, leaving, said that he understood everything, and the Lord helped him a lot. The Lord, taken aback, said that he was glad to hear it. Fenric looked at the Lord closely and said that he had heard that he had quite a refined taste in works of art. The Duke said that he too had recently become interested in art and was now looking for a companion with a discerning eye. Noah looked at him in surprise and asked what exactly he meant by companion. The Duke said that he didn't usually socialize much with other nobles, but he thought that talking to him might be a good opportunity. Fenric said he had been interested in Noah and his view on art for some time now. Noah was taken aback and froze for a moment as he realized that there was definitely a catch in this situation. Just recently, he lamented that the Deverne family was losing its place as the Emperor's key supporters. And now, Duke Fenric, the Emperor's closest confidant, was drawing closer to him. He looked at the Duke with a beaming smile and thanked him for the offer, since he had recently become terribly bored with nobles. He was puzzled, since none of them appreciated fine art. He smiled and asked the Duke if he would like to see his collection since he was visiting him. Sometime later, with a satisfied smile, he opened the door and asked the Duke to come inside. The Duke looked around the room intently. Noah, with a joyful smile, told the Duke about all his sculptures. At that very moment, he showed the Duke his best creation, for in his collection there was a taxidermy monster. The Duke sighed heavily, and looking at the sculpture, told the young man that it was truly beautiful. Looking around, the Duke asked the young man if he really came to this room alone. Noah looked hard at the Duke and said with a smile that he had maids, but sent them away after dinner, as he could not know when, and their dirty hands could spoil his collection. So he did not allow them to walk in the room when he was not watching them. He also informed them that he had given them a few days off from tomorrow afternoon, as he wanted to enjoy some privacy for a while. The Duke looked at him intently. Fenric looked at the young man with a predatory and menacing look, and asked if no one would know anything until tomorrow morning if something happened to him right now. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a question. He did not understand what the Duke wanted to say with such words. The Duke smiled and said that he was just joking. At the same moment, he said that with such valuable items that were collected in their room, he could attract a thief, so he must be careful. He sighed heavily and said that the Duke was right. The Duke smiled, and looking at the statue, said that it was beautiful. He asked Noah where he had acquired it. Noah, with admiration, told the Duke about all his valuable statues. The Duke, in turn, drew attention to a small door in the room. The young lady's past life flashed before his eyes, and Noah looked at the young, beautiful lady with admiration and said that she was beautiful enough to remain in his domain as taxidermy. Precep burst into tears and asked the young man to let her go, but all attempts were in vain. After some time, she despaired, because she understood that no one would rescue her from captivity. She was lost, and the Duke knew it. He was burning with rage and anger as he looked at the young man because he knew who he really was. The second event starts with the cost of a single letter. Shortly after the coronation banquet, the factions of the emperor deposed by Dietrich were arrested. He looked at them with fury and announced that they would be executed as traitors who dared to speak out against the empire. At that very moment, he said that they had found the letter from the traitors. The emperor began reading the letter, but a moment later, he froze with fury on his face. After a while, he called the young lady to audience and ordered her to speak immediately. He was angry and asked her how it was possible that a secret that only she knew was mentioned in the traitor's letter. Trembling with fear, she said that she did not know anything like this. The letter stated that the emperor wept at the grave of his late mother, the empress, every year on the day of her death. It was a deep personal secret that only she knew about because she was always by his side. After this, the emperor immediately locked her in a cage. She screamed and asked him to believe her because she swore that she was not guilty. From that moment on, depending on the one she met, the path and history of development was determined. She understood that due to the death of the prince and the mistakes with the emperor, everything could go wrong. Precep was puzzled because even after checking everything, she did not find anything unusual in the system. But a moment later, she noticed a small detail. She looked at the church in surprise because she didn't know where it was, and so she wondered if it had always been next to her. Precep, in turn, was sure that it had not been on the map before, so she wondered if this was a new location. After a few seconds, she threw away all her assumptions and thoughts as she heard someone calling hers. In a hurry, she closed the window of notifications from the maid. The maid in turn looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not understand what was wrong with her. At that very moment, the maid told the young lady that she should go out, because a guest had arrived. Persepe was very surprised, because she did not expect such a thing. Some time later, she finally met the Duke, and they drank tea in silence. The Duke apologized for the inconvenience he had caused her with his sudden visit. Persepe quickly said that everything was fine, because he said that he needed to discuss something with her. The Duke said that in fact it was not a very important conversation. He informed her that the prince and his retinue had returned to the empire this morning, and that apparently the matter would be settled without any difficulties. At that moment, the young lady asked if it was known who was behind his death. The Duke sighed heavily and said that unfortunately they had not yet established this, but they intended to continue to thoroughly investigate this matter, regardless of diplomatic relations with the empire. So he asked her not to worry. She breathed a sigh of relief, and a moment later asked him if that was why he had come to her personally. Persepe said that if he wanted to know anything else, he could ask the emperor since she had told him everything. Fenric, while drinking tea, informed the young lady that this was all he wanted to check. She looked at him in bewilderment, but he said that was quite enough. A moment later, the Duke asked the young lady if she liked the tea. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected such a question. She was puzzled and embarrassed, because she understood that due to the cheapness of these tea leaves, they were not to the taste of the nobles. She hesitated, not knowing what answer to give him, and at that moment, the Duke smiled tenderly and said that the aroma was simply wonderful and that he really liked the tea. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected anything like this. At that very moment, he asked if she didn't like flowers. She was taken aback, as she had never said anything like that before. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had simply noticed that the vase was empty. Persepe had not paid any attention to this because of everything that had happened to her recently. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that her maid was neglecting her duties because it was impossible to leave the vase empty. She froze for a moment in a daze, since she did not know when the vase appeared in her room. The Duke said he wasn't sure if she had heard, but there would be a festival in town in a few days. He told her that flags would be raised, traders from different countries would arrive, and the air would be filled with music during the festival, while ufologists woven from flowers, a spectacle that could not fail to please the eye, would also be available to ordinary people. He smiled tenderly and said that he was simply sure that she would enjoy this spectacle. Persepe froze. After his words, which were filled with tenderness, she didn't even know that there would be a festival, but she wasn't very disappointed since she had never left this place before and didn't know what a festival was like. But still, she smiled and said that it just sounded wonderful, but unfortunately, she couldn't see it. She sighed heavily and said that she could not leave this place. The Duke sighed heavily and said that perhaps everything would change. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he said. He smiled and asked if she wouldn't be terribly bored if she lived her life following a predetermined path. At the same time, Noah, with surprise on his face, looked out into the salvo, since he did not understand what kind of noise he heard. But a moment later, he froze in shock as he saw a beautiful statue in front of him. He was puzzled because he did not know who could have provided it to him. Noah saw that it was truly enormous and crafted with skill. He understood that there was no one who could give him such a gift. But a moment later, he was taken aback. He wondered with delight if this was a gift from the Grand Duke. Noah looked at the statue with a grin, as he knew that although the Duke was of low birth, he certainly had an eye for quality. After some time, he noticed an aromatic candle near the beautiful statue. He realized that this was unexpectedly romantic on his part. After some time, the room was filled with a beautiful and exquisite aroma. Noah gazed at the statue with admiration, and at the same time, he studied every detail of it. But after some time, he noticed the burning eyes of a bird of prey. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, and with surprise asked them if she really wanted to go outside. Persepe, while getting ready, said that everything was just like that because she wanted to visit the church. She knew that the next event was about to start, and this was her only chance. She wanted to hurry and check if there were any clues for her there. Ella was furious. She screamed that the young lady could not do this. She screamed that if the lady wanted to leave the tower, she must first get permission from the emperor. Persepe looked at him closely, but in his calm manner, she told the maid that she would only go for a few minutes' walk. She also asked the maid if she would not go with her to pray for the emperor's well-being. She asked the maid if she really didn't want to go with her, Ella, in turn, froze in place, rooted to the spot, not knowing what to answer. Precep looked closely at her maid, as she saw that she was thinking about whether to let her go alone or go with her. She saw that the maid was weighing which option would allow her to avoid problems. Ella looked at the young lady sharply and said that she should just go into the church and come back immediately. She looked menacingly at the lady and said that she should not do anything thoughtless. Precep sighed heavily, but still agreed. She knew that even if she were caught, they would simply accuse her of getting out on her own and scold her. A moment later, she was already assembled. But at that very moment, she looked intently at the small vase. She asked Ella if the maids had brought the vase to her room. Ella looked at the young lady in surprise and said that it was she who brought her to the tower when she first came to the tower, Precep. Since she did not remember this, but in turn, she said that everything was correct and she simply forgot. She sighed heavily as she realized that no one had brought it, but at the same moment, she was taken aback as she clearly remembered that day. At the beginning of her journey to win sympathy after dying dozens of times and going through harsh trials in prison, she returned to the tower beaten and bruised. She was lost after all the torment, but she froze for a moment when she saw a small vase and beautiful flowers in it. She was surprised because she did not expect to see such a beautiful you in such a gloomy place. Since then, having gone through the same event hundreds of times, she found solace in flowers. She stared at the empty vase. After all, she was puzzled and did not know who had been leaving the flowers all this time. At that very moment, the maid hurried the nth lady, as she knew that she had to return back quickly. Precep was puzzled and thought that most likely this was some kind of mistake. She understood that mistakes did occur in the game. As she approached the church, she looked around and noticed that there was no one around, so she wondered if it was time for prayer. She felt relieved, because if she was caught in the church, she would feel very bad, and she could not even imagine what the emperor would do to her. But as she stepped over the threshold of the church, she fell with a crash, as unfortunately, she collided with a young man. At that very moment, she shouted that she had not tried to escape at all. She shouted that she would return soon and asked the young man not to tell the emperor about it. But when the young lady opened her eyes, she froze for a moment in surprise, as she saw a young man who was more beautiful than anyone in the world. She assumed that there was a priest in front of her now, but looking at his clothes, she realized that he was not a priest. She was alarmed because she did not know who was in front of her. Precep looked at the young man with admiration, because she saw that he was very handsome, just like Duke Fenric. She was delighted and saw that he was an angel who was from a fairy tale. They stared at each other for a moment without saying a word. He reached out to her. She froze for a moment, looking at him as she was completely absorbed by his beauty. She slowly raised her hand and thanked him, but to her surprise and amazement, he simply turned around and walked away. She was embarrassed and very ashamed. She felt hurt that he didn't help her. The young lady finally collected her thoughts and stood up, brushing off all the dust. She realized that he was leaving the church, and so she assumed that he could be connected with the captain of the knights. But as soon as the young lady turned her gaze towards the church premises, she froze in shock. She was shocked by what she saw, as she saw that all the statues in the church were destroyed. Precep was very shocked and did not understand what had happened, as she saw that not a single whole statue remained. But at that very moment, she saw a small piece of the statue and looked at the inscription with surprise. At that very second, a notification window appeared in front of her. She saw some information about the subject, but unfortunately, everything about the scripture was in errors. Precep was puzzled as she saw that the destroyed statues had caused an error. She did not understand why someone would deliberately do something like that. At that very moment, she shuddered as she heard the priest's cry. She turned around and froze as she saw a man who was shocked by everything he saw. A moment later, he looked at her with fury and asked what she had done. He was sure that she had destroyed all the sacred statues. The young lady was taken aback and hastened to put back the piece she had picked up. She looked at the priest with fear in her eyes as he accused her of damaging the sacred statue. Some time later, they were sitting in a small room. The young lady told the priest that all her words were true. She looked at him intently and said that today was her first time in church, and she had no reason at all to destroy the statues beyond recognition. The priest looked at her intently and did not ask if she really wanted to say that someone had resigned themselves to doing this right in the middle of the palace. He saw that she was the only one in the church. Precep, in turn, recalling all the events, said that during the course of the event, she encountered her man. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand who she was talking about. Precep said that, unfortunately, She did not know who he was, but his attire looked like that of a priest, and she did not see any weapons. She reported that he had blonde hair and blue eyes. The priest looked at her with rage and said that she must swear that she was not lying. She was shocked and screamed that her words were true. He sighed heavily and said that since it was, as she said, then he would ask the Imperial Guard to investigate. A moment later, the young lady asked what the statue was behind them. The priest looked back and said that she had not had history lessons, and therefore she might not know this information. He said that this statue depicts a scene from the mythology of Adaloil. She was surprised and looked at him as she did not understand what he was talking about. The priest said that at the very beginning, a cursed creature lived in the west of the continent. The epidemics followed closely behind this creature, and also the curse and countless deaths of people. For countless years, humanity struggled to get rid of it, choosing many warriors, and dozens of knights perished in the process. And at the moment when people needed it most, a hero appeared. The hero silenced the creature forever. Although it happened long before the statue was created every day, people praised the hero, and a festival was held in his honor every year. Precep looked intently at the priest and asked what creature he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that this creature was called Maven. He knew that there was a reason why he was called that. The young lady thought for a moment everything had been said. At that very moment, the priest saw the young lady's maid and said that she needed to return to the tower. Ella quickly entered the hall and looked intently at the lady. At that very moment, she called her mistress, but she hesitated and did not know how to inform the young league of the news. Precep looked closely at the maid as she was very nervous. Ella reported that the emperor suddenly became ill. Precep was shocked by what she heard. At that very moment, she ran up to her maid and asked what it meant that he suddenly felt ill. The maid was taken aback and said that he had been complaining of a headache since dawn, and then suddenly lost consciousness. Precep was very surprised and stunned because she knew that the emperor had never been ill. She wondered if his memories were returning to him. Ella said that this was the reason they brought the duke instead of the emperor. At that very moment, the young lady saw the duke in all his glory before her. She was shocked because she didn't expect to see him so quickly. He looked at her intently and with a gentle smile said that he was glad to see her again. He also reported that he heard from the maid that she was heading to church. The duke looked hard at the priest and said that, even if this investigation, he had delayed the young lady too long. The priest was taken aback and asked the duke in surprise what he meant by such words, since he simply wanted to hear from the young lady what had happened. The duke looked coldly at the archbishop and said that he had heard that after the lady had gone into the church, he had witnessed what had happened, but given the circumstances, it would have been better for the guards to ask questions. They were standing outside. The duke understood that it was absolutely impossible to torture an innocent person in such a way. The high priest was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. The duke looked at the high priest with anger and asked if it was really because the young lady in front of him was Melissa who had to do this. Precep looked at the duke with a look of intent and embarrassment as he defended her. The high priest, taken aback, said that this was not what he meant at all. The duke looked at the maid and said that she must finish the investigation. A moment later, he turned to the young lady and said that he would show her the way. Sometime later, they were slowly walking back to the tower. As they walked along the road, she told the duke what she had actually seen. She was puzzled and could not imagine that something like this could happen just when she decided to go to church. She looked at the duke in surprise as if he knew something. She called him, but he did not answer as he was immersed in his thoughts. At that very moment, he turned around and asked her to continue her story. She was taken aback and looked away from him in embarrassment as she realized that she had talked too much. She knew that she had not had the opportunity to relax lately, so she unconsciously stopped talking to herself. The lady looked at the duke with confusion as she remembered how the rest had spoken to her earlier, so she assumed that he was more favorable to the war than she had previously thought. At the same moment, she thanked him for helping her. The duke was in a hurry as he did not expect anything like this. She sighed heavily and said that people were only making fun of her because she had the status of the deposed princess in the imperial palace, but he was the first person who was kind to her, so she was sincerely happy about such an event. After her words, Precep looked at the duke with embarrassment and sideways glance, and wondered if she had said too much. He looked at her closely and said that he felt like she felt comfortable around him. She looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. The duke smiled tenderly and said that when he saw her recently, she was so nervous that he could not even meet his eyes. He smiled and said that he preferred things to be as they were. Looking at the young lady, he said that she should not worry, and he understood perfectly well that in this situation, she was not to blame. And he knew that even if the emperor found out about everything, it would not cause any problems. Persephone froze for a moment when she heard about the emperor. She wondered if it was true. She knew that the emperor, suspicious of everything, would never let this pass by his ears. She understood that he would leave aside the issue of the destroyed statues, since he could assume that she was already in collusion with someone. The Duke, looking at the young lady, said that it seemed to him that she did not believe she was taken aback, as she had plunged too deeply into her thoughts. He looked at her with a smile and asked, "How about making a bet?" Persephone looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He said that if something unpleasant really happened because of this, then he would lose. But if everything went quietly, then the lady would lose. He smiled and said that in the end, the loser gets the winner's wish. He looked at her closely and asked what she would say in response to her statement. Persephone was a little puzzled and immediately said that she might not have the opportunity to fulfill the Duke's wish. He smiled and said that they would think about it when it was all over. Persephone knew perfectly well that another event would soon begin, and she would go down a different path so she would not meet the Duke again. But in turn, she smiled and agreed with him. The Duke looked at the young lady with a contented and tender smile. A moment later, Fenric, looking at the young lady, said that she should remember something. She always looked at him with skill, but he said that they had just made a bet. For some time, the young lady watched the Duke closely from her tower. He stood for a moment looking at the young lady, but a moment later, he turned and walked away. She was sad because she knew that once this event ended, the storyline would change, and she would not see him again. Some time ago, the Duke spoke to the young lady and said that he needed to know something about the maid. He bowed and said that it was time for him to leave. Persephone assumed that this was their last meeting, and surprisingly, she felt a little sad. After all, he was the only person who had ever been kind to her. The emperor looked intently at the young lady and quietly called her. He breathed a sigh of relief as he could finally trust her. At the same time, he watched everything that was happening from afar. The emperor denied the murder because he knew that he had never done anything like that. He understood that it was simple misunderstanding because nothing like this had ever happened in his life. Some time later, he finally woke up from a long nightmare, screaming and calling for the young lady. Dietrich was very worried because he had another nightmare. From the day they last spoke, every day, he began to have nightmares, dreams in which he killed Persephone over and over again. He was furious because he knew he hadn't done anything like that. But after another nightmare, his confidence in doing so had diminished. Dietrich was puzzled and wondered if this was his true nature. He remembered the young lady screaming with tears in her eyes, that she had never betrayed him. She said that even when she was little, she had not invented him and had no intention of doing so. The emperor was puzzled and did not know what was going on. After some time, he heard the knight as he was surprised that the emperor had woken up. The knight informed the emperor that it was already dawn and he had slept all day, so he intended to call a doctor. Dietrich refused the knight because he knew that nothing serious had happened. He asked the knight what had happened during the day of his absence. Looking at the emperor, the knight sadly reported that there was a commotion in the palace, so he came to the temperature. But we will report everything. The knight hesitated and said that an intruder had entered the church and destroyed all the statues. Looking at the emperor, he reported that Persephone had witnessed what had happened. The emperor froze in shock, as he had not expected such a thing. He looked at the knight in surprise and asked if he really said that the nth lady was in the church. The knight said that it was exactly so, because the young lady went to the church to pray for the health of the emperor, and then she witnessed the incident. At that very moment, the emperor fell asleep from shock and wondered if it was possible that the young lady was somehow connected with the criminal. The knight said that this was not true, since there was no evidence linking her to this incident. The emperor thought for a moment and shoved the millet into his mouth. The young lady was once again preparing to escape, just like in childhood. Dietrich wondered if the destroyed statues of his church were meant to create chaos. He remembered her voice and how she said that she was not guilty and he should believe her. At the same moment, he would wonder if his suspicions had become mania. A few seconds later, the knight informed the emperor that he had received a letter. He told his master that it contained no magic, no curses, no threats, and that it did not bear the family crest. The emperor froze for a moment when he read the letter. Some time later, the maid came to the young league and called her. She looked intently at Persephone and announced that the emperor would call her for an audience. Precep sighed heavily, as she already knew what would happen next, because events were already beginning to unfold as always. After some time, the young lady came to an audience with the emperor. Dietrich looked at her menacingly, and holding back his rage said that he had always underestimated her, because even sitting locked up and under surveillance in the tower, she still found a way to conspire with others. The young lady froze for a moment, as she had no choice icons and didn't know what to answer. She didn't expect him to believe her at all, but she wondered if she should talk to him honestly for the first time in a long time. She only wanted to do it now. She did not want to be tortured cruelly again. The emperor looked at her with cold fury and anger, and shouted at her to answer his question immediately. At that moment, she sighed heavily and said that it was unfair because she had never revealed his secret to anyone, and she had never colluded with anyone. He looked at her in surprise and asked if these were really vile accusations. She screamed with rage and released her emotions because she was telling him the truth. Precep screamed that she couldn't go anywhere, and the only people she could talk to were this pair of maids in the tower. She looked at him intently and asked him plaintively how she could do something like that. She was furious and did not understand why it was always the emperor who did not understand her. He froze looking at the young lady as he did not expect such a thing. He sighed heavily and asked if he should really believe her. At that very moment, the young people turned around as they heard the duke's voice. They were surprised because they did not expect him to appear in the hall. The duke in turn looked closely at everyone present. He was determined to sort out this situation as quickly as possible. At that very moment, they saw behind the duke a servant who was trembling with fear. Precep looked at them in surprise, as she didn't understand what was going on at all. The emperor looked closely at the duke and asked what was going on. He did not understand why he had come to them, since this matter did not concern him. The duke looked at the emperor intently and said that this was not so. A moment later, he pointed to the maid and announced that he had brought the real criminal. He said that it was the maid who colluded with the rebels. Everyone present was shocked by this news. While exploring the church, he looked through the maid's belongings and found something very suspicious. He informed the emperor that he had found a letter that was written in code, and therefore he assumed that the maid had been corresponding with the rebels for a long time. Her statement that she was a loyal servant and a young TV diva was a cover, and to obtain information from a person close to the emperor. Precep was surprised, and at the same time shocked, because nothing like this had ever happened before. The emperor was furious and shouted that this was just nonsense. At that very moment, the duke said that Noah Deverne was found dead. Precep froze in shock, as she didn't expect to hear anything like that. At that very moment, the duke reported that the young man had been found dead anywhere, and it was assumed that he had been attacked by an animal. But since he had no close friends, the investigation stalled, and so coincidentally, almost all the servants were on vacation at that time. His body was discovered too late. The duke sighed heavily and said that this was a truly unfortunate situation. The emperor was furious because he could not even imagine that the beast was in the heart of the capital. He furiously asked the duke if he really thought that this was true possible. The duke sighed heavily and said that he did not think it was possible. The emperor looked at him in surprise, as he did not understand what he was talking about. The duke said that this was impossible because a foreign prince was killed in the imperial palace, and a nobleman in the capital was torn to pieces by a beast. And this could not be a simple coincidence. Fenric told the emperor that he had already heard that the young lady had seen a suspicious man in the church. Looking at the emperor, he asked if it was not strange that the same person was at the center of all the events, and it was also proven that her closest servant was connected with their rebels. The duke looked at the young man with fury and asked what he was hinting at. He asked in a dull voice whether the duke was really accusing the young lady just now. But the duke said in a calm manner that the young lady had become someone's target, and it seemed that she had miraculously managed to avoid trouble so far. But there was no guarantee that she would be lucky next time. For this reason, he humbly offered to temporarily take the young lady out of the palace for her safety. The emperor in turn looked at the young man with anger, but did not answer. After a few minutes, he firmly said that he was against it. Dietrich, looking at everyone present, said that if this was true, then he now had even more reasons to keep her in the castle, because the imperial palace was the safest place in the empire. The duke looked closely at the emperor and reported that the first incident had taken place in the palace, and as far as they knew, the criminal could still move freely within the castle walls. He said that until the truth became known, it would be better for the young lady to hide outside the palace and return when she was ensured safety. The emperor was furious and said that the young lady could not just leave because this was the safest place for her. But the emperor in turn was puzzled and wondered if this was true. He was worried that what was happening in his dreams could become reality, because even now he wanted to punish her for his suspicions. He remembered how in his dream he had screamed furiously at his knights to immediately execute the pathetic traitor. Then she burst into tears, screaming that she didn't do it and begging him to believe her. The Duke looked closely at the emperor and said that he and no one else would protect the young lady. The emperor was taken aback by such words. The Duke said that he had a remote estate on the outskirts of the capital, which almost no one knew about, so she could stay there and monitor what was happening until the situation calmed down. Looking at the emperor, he said that he had sworn allegiance to him even before he ascended the throne so he could trust him. The emperor thought for a moment, for he knew this to be true, and the Duke had been his best ally during his ascension to the throne. He understood that the Duke was in fact the most trustworthy. He understood that if rumors started to spread and people started to speak ill of the young lady, since she had originally been cursed and sent to the tower, she could also be accused of destroying the sacred statues. He understood that if the young lady's name was on the lips of the people, they might rebel and punish her very cruelly. The emperor was puzzled and did not know what to do in this situation. Precep looked at the Duke in surprise, as she had previously thought that he was close to the emperor and should always be on his side. At that very moment, she was taken aback as she heard the emperor's voice. The emperor looked at her intently and asked what she wanted. She froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a question at all. The emperor looked at her with a tired look and asked if she wanted to leave the palace. She froze for a moment, as she was shocked by what she heard. She was confused and didn't know what would happen if she left the palace. She understood that if she left the tower, she would no longer be able to use the system because there was no information outside the palace, and she had no idea what could have happened. And if she really became someone's target, then she would not be able to respond in time. She knew the risk was too great, but even so, there was one reason why she wanted to leave the palace. She froze for a moment, but the emperor urged her on. Precep only wanted to survive and return back to reality. At that very moment, she said that she wanted to do as the Grand Duke suggested. Precep looked closely at the emperor after her sincere answer. She begged the emperor to let her go until the danger was over. The emperor in turn became depressed and for a moment lost in his thoughts, but at the same time he was very confused. But he sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. Later, he turned to the Duke and called him. He sighed heavily and asked the Duke to escort the lady outside the palace. She froze in shock and wondered if he was really serious in letting her go now. The Duke bowed and said that he would do everything immediately. At that very moment, the emperor said that the knights should immediately put the maid in prison and interrogate her. He wanted her to immediately tell about everything connected with the rebels. The Duke looked at the young lady and said with a smile that it was time for them to go. She froze for a moment when she saw his beaming, victorious smile. The emperor in turn looked after them intently. A moment later, the young lady stopped as she heard the emperor's voice. He sighed heavily, collecting his thoughts. But a moment later, he looked up at the young lady and asked if she had anything she wanted to tell him. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. He asked if he had misunderstood her. She looked at him silently, not answering his question. Precep sighed heavily and looked intently at the emperor. She was asking questions about whether she needed to clarify his misunderstanding, even at such a moment. Bowing, she said that she had nothing to say to him, and therefore she wanted to leave as soon as possible. Some time later, the young lady and the Duke went to his residence. The Duke looked at the young lady with a tender smile as he saw her admiring gaze. It warmed his soul to think that she liked this view. The young lady, in turn, enjoyed every moment and the flow of fresh air. She saw a busy and beautiful market, and she smelled the sweet smell of food, and she heard music pouring through the streets. She felt the spring breeze and the wonderful scent of flowers. And most importantly, she realized the fact that she no longer had to worry about the terrible events. A moment later, Fenric knocked softly on the coach's door. He asked the coachman to slow down and drive as slowly as he could. He did this so that the young lady could fully enjoy the beautiful view. Some time later, he informed her that they had arrived at the place. He sighed heavily and said that they had moved in a hurry, and he hoped that his modest home would not offend her. She froze in shock when she saw the beautiful residence. She was amazed because the place could not be called modest. She saw that the castle looked as if it were the most majestic in the empire. Some time later, the Duke led the young lady to her room, and he also informed her that from today on, he would increase the security several times so that she would not have to worry about her safety in the castle. She listened to him with only one ear as she enjoyed the beautiful room. Fenric looked at her with bewilderment as he saw that she was running around the room like a little squirrel. At that very moment, he noticed that she had brought with her an old vase. She slowly walked to the window and put the vase down. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect her to bring such an old vase, as he knew that there were many of you in the estate. Perseps said with a smile that this vase was special to her. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect to hear something like that. In the past, he came to her quietly under the cover of night. The Duke did nothing inappropriate. He simply brought her modest flowers. Fenric looked at the young lady with a smile. A moment later, he said that whoever gave it to her must be very happy. At that very moment, he gave in to his emotions and reached out to the young lady as if he wanted to hug her, but he stopped his hand in time. And at that very moment, he asked with a smile if she would like to go to the garden, because they had planted many exotic flowers and trees, so she could choose what she liked and immediately put them in a vase. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really liked flowers. He thought for a moment and said, it wasn't that he didn't like them or that he liked them. Although he knew he had to work hard to hire a gardener on short notice, she looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. Fenric said with a smile that he would show her the rest of the palace if they went now. Some time later, the young lady was sleeping quietly and peacefully in her new room. The Duke looked at her closely as he was glad that she had finally relaxed. He noticed that she had fallen into a deep sleep. He walked slowly and quietly out of the room and told the maid that the young lady was very tired and she had to make sure that no one entered her room. He slowly walked away from the room and stopped because he had been waiting for a long time for the day when she would come to him. He knew that all his efforts that he had invested in this place for so long had paid off in full today. A moment later, he entered the room and froze for a moment as he heard a familiar voice. The young man smiled and said that he almost didn't recognize the place. He smiled and said it looked like a newly built estate, noting that the Duke had put a lot of effort into it. At that very moment, he said with a grin that unfortunately he was sickened by the suffocating smell of flowers. He asked the Duke if he agreed with him. The young man looked at the Duke with a satisfied grin, waiting for an answer. He looked closely at the Duke and reported that by some miracle, he had managed to get the griffin back, but it had not been easy. Fenric sighed heavily and said that there was nothing in the empire that he could not get. The young man smiled and asked if he was serious when he said this. He asked with a grin if he was really talking about the young lady now. He sighed heavily and said that he thought some unpleasant guy had already taken an interest in her. Looking at the Duke, he said dryly that this was the Archmage of the Empire, and he also heard that they had already begun an investigation in that place of Noah Deverne. He approached the Duke with a predatory grin and said that they would sort this out soon enough. And looking at the Duke, he asked if he was nervous. The Duke looked menacingly at the young man and said that it did not matter at all. Fenric said angrily that the same end awaited the young man as the prince, but he still asked the young man to explain something to him. He was furious and did not understand why he went into the church. The young man looked away from his comrade as he did not want to answer this question. The Duke was puzzled and did not understand why he had broken all the statues, since this was not in the plan. The young man smiled and said that everything turned out well in the end. The Duke looked at him with fury and asked what he was talking about. He moved closer to the Duke and said with a grin that thanks to this, they now had one more reason to get the young lady out of the imperial palace. He, looking at the Duke, asked not to push him away because he was still helping him at all. He also said that everything was going according to his plan, and he should agree with it. At that very moment, he used his power and easily disappeared from the Duke's sight. Fenric was furious because he knew he would never be able to predict his thoughts. He sighed heavily because unfortunately he could not kill him easily. He really wanted to remain the only one for her. The Archmage of the Empire looked with disgust at all the exhibits of the young man because he understood that the Lord was simply a madman who collected all sorts of junk. At that very moment, the young man called his mentor and told him where the body was. Ivan sighed heavily and said that he had already seen enough and roughly understood what had happened, and there was no longer any need for him to look at the corpse. The young man was taken aback and said that this was the most terrible scene he had ever seen, and a similar beast tore out the young man's throat. Unfortunately, not a single whole part of the body remained. Although he realized that this was very strange, since the beast could not be in the capital, he also noticed that nothing was stolen and assumed that it was not a robbery. Ivan sighed heavily and wondered if the young man was facing the revenge of the taxidermied specimens. But after a few seconds, his attention was drawn to a small candle because it was near the statue. At that very moment, he looked at the piece of candle with a fierce grin as he assumed that someone was deliberately fooling them. Some time later, the young lady slowly opened her eyes as she woke up from a long and pleasant sleep. She froze for a moment, not realizing where she was, but after a few seconds, she realized that she was at the Duke's estate. At that very moment, she fell onto the bed with their crash. She understood that this was not a dream, and she really had left the imperial castle. Precep sighed heavily and asked the system to show her the event log, or the last memory. But unfortunately, she saw and heard only silence in response. She sighed heavily since her assumptions were correct, that the system did not work outside the tower. She understood that this did not matter at all, since she had information, and this was already more than enough. Precep understood perfectly well that only a book of memories remained, but the future was inaccessible to her, since she did not know the name of the main character. At that very moment, she was taken aback and turned around as she saw flowers in her vase. She was a little puzzled, because she didn't know how long the flowers had been in the room. She was amazed by the beauty of the beautiful flowers. At that very moment, a maid entered the room and said with a smile that yesterday the Grand Duke personally put the flowers in the vase. Precep looked in surprise at the maid whom she saw for the first time. The maid greeted the young lady with a radiant smile and introduced herself, saying that her name was Hannah. Hannah smiled and told the young lady that from that moment on, she would be her personal maid. She asked the lady to tell her if she needed anything. Precep, since she did not expect anything like this, but at the same moment with a smile, said that she was looking forward to their joint work. She noticed that the maid was very nice. At that very moment, Hannah, with a joyful smile, asked the lady how she slept, since she had chosen this velvet blanket with special care. Precep said with a smile that she had slept wonderfully, and also thanked the maid. Although this kindness was unusual for her, Hannah smiled and said that the lady could throw away all formalities and talk to her calmly, and she also said that she had already prepared breakfast and asked the lady if she wanted to wash first. Precep was very excited, and at the same time puzzled by this attitude towards her, and said with a smile that she would wash herself first. She looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not understand why she was still in the room. Hannah, with a joyful smile, pounced on the young lady and began to hug her, as she had been waiting for her for a very long time, and now she was beside herself with joy. Precep was shocked by everything that was happening and assumed that they had met somewhere before. She was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing from the maid, and asked her to let her go. At that time, there was a meeting in the Northern Magic Tower. The commander of the knights, Siegfried, visited it. Also present at the meeting was the Grand Duke Fenric. Siegfried looked at Ivan intently and said that it was very strange, although they were suspicious of everyone who entered the tower, and yet they were called into the tower. Ivan sighed heavily and said that this was already better than going to church. Siegfried looked at him with fury and told him to watch his disrespectful language. Siegfried looked intently at Ivan and asked if they could finally find out the reason for this gathering. Siegfried looked at Ivan in surprise and asked if their comrade had really been killed. Ivan sighed heavily and said that this was true, and he now had evidence in his hands. At that very moment, they all clearly saw a small flower. He informed them that it was a magical plant, and it was called moongrass. The flower had such a rare name that almost no one knew anything about it. It was a type of hallucinogen that after use caused a state similar to a comatose sleep. Ivan looked at everyone closely and said that everyone knew about this, but it affected monsters differently, and this flower did not just awaken them from sleep. He had heard that this aroma could resurrect them from the dead. Of course, temporarily, Siegfried was puzzled and did not understand what this had to do with the matter. Ivan sighed heavily and casually told the young man not to rush him, as he now intended to explain everything to them. A moment later, he said that he had found an aromatic candle in the house of the dead young man. Although it was almost completely burnt out, but he still managed to find traces of the moon plant in it. He assumed that someone had deliberately used this plant and monsters to kill the young man, and there was no doubt about it. He looked closely at the young people and said that the given plant grows only in the Forbidden Forest. Siegfried was taken aback, since the conversation turned to the Forbidden Forest. Ivan sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly so. He looked casually at the young man and asked if it was necessary to shout like that to understand this fact. They all knew that in that god-forsaken place, there was a lair of monsters. Ivan looked at them intently and said that the young man had often been there under the pretext of hunting and should be well acquainted with the territory. The captain of the knights was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. Siegfried sighed heavily because he understood that given all the circumstances of the case, it was difficult to believe that the killer was an ordinary person. He understood that he was capable of dealing with monsters and freely walking through the forbidden forest, a very difficult man. He was puzzled. He didn't understand why Noah had interfered with such a person. Ivan inhaled the number. He didn't know this on the council, and therefore he had to find out everything. A moment later, Siegfried turned to the Grand Duke. Siegfried, looking at the Grand Duke, said that he had previously heard that the young lady had encountered someone suspicious, and so he thought that he should deal with that person first. Fenrik sighed heavily and said that this was logical. Siegfried, looking at everyone present, said that the emperor was very upset about this, and he also said that the young lady had left the palace, and therefore he was very worried. Ivan looked intently at the duke and asked if the problem would be solved as soon as the young lady returned to the palace. Ivan said that she was no longer a princess, and they did not need to treat her with respect. The captain was furious and shouted at Ivan that he had no manners at all, and he should treat her with respect. Siegfried said that the young lady would return because the palace was guarded by loyal knights, and this was the safest place for her. And besides, he personally intended to take care of her safety. Ivan was surprised because he did not know that the captain cared about her so much, and he was also very surprised that the emperor allowed her to leave the tower. The duke, in turn, looked at them with fury, but a moment later, he said it was not something they should worry about. He was burning with anger and fury because he did not understand why they were so interested in this. The young people looked at the duke in surprise, as they did not understand his reaction. He asked with restrained rage if they really thought so, even though the criminal was still in the palace. The duke rose to his feet with lightning speed and said that if they made any progress in their investigation, they were to report to him immediately. Ivan sighed heavily as he noticed that the duke was in a foul mood. Capital knew that given his long relationship with the emperor, it was understandable that he was on edge. He sighed heavily, and looking at the young man, told him to stop chatting because they had to concentrate on this matter. The captain sighed heavily and said that he intended to send the knights to the village near the forest. He also informed Ivan that depending on the results of the investigation, they might need the help of the tower's mages. Ivan looked at the young man in bewilderment and asked if there were really still villages near the forest. He sighed heavily and asked if they really enjoyed the dangerous life, since he knew that monsters sometimes attacked them. The captain looked at the young man with contempt and anger because he spoke like a protected person who sat in a tower that was cut off from reality. The captain said that there was a time when monsters attacked much more often. Ivan looked at him in surprise as he did not understand what he was talking about. The captain said that in recent years, the number of monsters that dared to come out of the forest had significantly decreased, and for this reason, the nearby villages were populated again. But at the same time, the forest itself remained a forbidden zone. Ivan was taken aback by surprise and asked if there really were fewer monsters. He was surprised and at the same time puzzled by this news. Some time later, the duke returned to his residence, but he was absorbed in his thoughts. He was furious because now everything became clear to him. He took the young lady to his place so that their paths would not cross. He understood that their instinctive interest in her remained. Fenrik was furious, for it seemed to him as if the gods themselves had bound them, and he was angry because he realized that they had forgotten everything they had done. He knew that only the young lady remembered their actions. He knew that she suffered silently, while they unknowingly inflicted new wounds on her. Fenrik was puzzled and did not understand how much longer this cycle should last. He wondered when they would let her go. Some time later, he arrived at his residence. He slowly walked back to the castle, but froze in place. In the distance, he saw a young, beautiful lady admiring the flowers. He stared at her as if enchanted, as if he could take his eyes off her. But at that very moment, a little beautiful girl appeared before him, who gave him her hand. Then he was taken aback and looked at her intently. They looked at each other in silence for a while, but at the same time they heard the roar of fireworks. Fenrik sighed heavily, as these memories were a little painful for him. At that very moment, the young lady turned around as she heard the duke calling her. She smiled and greeted him. He asked her with a smile if she liked the mansion. Precep said with a smile that she liked everything. She liked him even too much, because she relaxed so much that she overslept, and now she felt awkward. He looked at her tenderly and said that he was very glad to hear such words. The Duke also said that there were many interesting things in the mansion, and she was free to look around it. He also said that the mansion had a library with books from all over the continent, and that in the rooms she could find clothes and jewelry. He assumed that she would like everything. She was taken aback in a way that she had not expected from him. Fenric looked at her in surprise and asked if Hannah had taken her to one of the rooms. The lady was taken aback and said that the maid had shown her everything. She was embarrassed, looked away from him, and said that she thought it was too generous, since even during her life in the palace, she had not been treated so generously. She sighed heavily because she saw the Duke's kindness, Hannah's kindness, and therefore she felt a little ashamed because she could not repay them with anything. Fenric looked at her tenderly and said that her joy was the best gratitude. Fenric sighed heavily and said that he was very upset to hear that she thought it was excessive. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true. She sighed heavily and said that she never thought she deserved to be treated like that. Fenric said with a smile that perhaps for her it was something insignificant that she had already forgotten. But someone lives thanks to this fleeting moment. Precep, in turn, froze for a moment, amazed by his words. She did not know what to answer. A moment later, she asked if the Duke had had a similar experience. Without looking at the young lady, he sighed heavily and said that it was so. After all, he was a commoner. She froze in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. Fenric sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, he did not know his parents one day. He was begging, and the next, he was being beaten. He knew that this was a typical fate, and of course, he thought that he would die on the street. He said with a gentle smile that one day something happened that turned his life upside down. Precep looked at the Duke intently as she was struck by his story. Because of his imposing aura, she was sure that he was one of the nobles, but she couldn't even imagine that he had such a past. Precep, with a gentle smile, told the Duke that he had gone through similar difficulties and achieved similar heights, and that this was impressive. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she really thought so. He sighed heavily as he understood that it was unlikely that everything was exactly like that, because if it weren't for her, he still wouldn't have gotten out of the slums. Sometime later, the young lady sat quietly in her new room. She was immersed in her thoughts as she remembered the Duke during the day. The atmosphere between them was somehow strange, but after a few seconds, she threw all her thoughts away, knowing that now was not the time to think about such things as she needed to hurry with the investigation. This game had an end date, the so-called choice day, where the young lady had to choose one main character and find out if she had achieved the good ending. In the system, she had to achieve maximum sympathy with the hero, which was achieved only if the young lady made the right choice with the selected character that day. If the choice was wrong or she scored fewer points than she needed, the ending will be sad. And even if her correct choice results in a low overall score, she still faces a bad ending. Now, when she didn't even know who the real protagonist was, she needed to find an urgent answer because time was running out. She was puzzled because she didn't know what she had missed. A moment later, she realized that she had missed the training and assumed that the protagonist was not from the palace. She did not remember the story of Precep from early childhood. She understood that she had to learn history between the ages of 10 and 15. The young lady was puzzled, as she had only seen it once when she first entered the game. If she thought about it, she had memorized the main plot, and she knew almost nothing about training. The young lady thought for a moment, as she remembered that it all ended with the execution of Precep's mother at the age of 15. She was taken aback for a moment as she remembered that just before the execution, she had spoken with her mother. Then, Mother told her to remember her words, but unfortunately, she could not remember what her mother said then. Precep was puzzled because she understood that if the main character was not from the palace, then she alone would not be able to cope. She was very upset and wondered if she should ask someone for help. Sometime later, she quietly knocked on the door of the Duke's room, and entering, she asked for forgiveness. But what she saw made her freeze in place, because she was very embarrassed. Precep did not expect to see the Duke in all his glory. At that very moment, she hid behind the door and asked the Duke for forgiveness, and also said that she would come to see him later. But he came closer to her and said that nothing terrible had happened, and she could come in. He sighed heavily and asked if that was what she really wanted. She said embarrassed that she wanted to ask him for a map, but at the same time, she looked around the room embarrassedly because she did not know where to go with her eyes. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect her to ask for a map. She was embarrassed and did not know what excuse I could come up with. At the same moment, she said embarrassedly that while sitting in the tower, she became interested in what the outside world looked like. He looked at her closely and said that he understood, and also informed her that he would take her out tomorrow morning. Persepe was surprised, but at the same time thanked him with a smile. A moment later, she looked at his body in surprise, as she saw a beautiful tattoo. She looked at her as if enchanted, and the Duke in turn tried to hide her. Fenric looked closely at the young lady and said that this was a rarity among the nobility. He asked if this was the first time she had seen something like this. She ran away and asked for forgiveness, but also asked if he really had a tree depicted on his body. He said that it was exactly like that, and each leaf was painted separately. She was surprised, as she saw that there were a lot of them. Fenric, looking away from the young lady, said that he added them every time something difficult happened. Fenric sighed heavily and said that when he needed to strengthen his resolve to not forget his feelings, he added a leaf. Persepe looked closely at the tree and said, "This tattoo is beautiful." At that very moment, the Duke approached the young lady and called her. He approached her very closely and tenderly and said that he would have a small request for her. She froze in place as she was embarrassed by such closeness. At the same time, Ivan was looking at the information. He was a little puzzled as he saw that the number of monsters was constantly growing, but suddenly stopped. He didn't know if something like this was possible naturally. At that very moment, the young man looked at Ivan with tears in his eyes and a joyful smile as he was working very hard. He sighed heavily and called the young man. He also said that they needed to check something. He frowned and asked his subordinate to bring him a list of everyone who had entered the Forbidden Forest, including ordinary citizens. The young people looked at each other intently for a while. Persepe looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what the request was. He looked at her with a keen gaze and asked if she remembered their recent bet. Persepe was taken aback as she remembered their recent dialogue. The Duke looked at her intently and informed her that he had won the bet. So now it was her turn to fulfill his wishes. She was taken aback and agreed, and also asked what his wish was. He looked at her with a satisfied smile and asked if he should make a wish today. The young lady froze for a moment as she was struck by his smile. At the same moment, he said with a smile that he would come back for her in the evening. The maid circled around the young lady in a hurry, not knowing what to do. She joyfully shouted to the young lady that she looked very beautiful in this outfit. She was puzzled and completely unable to choose a suitable outfit. Persepe froze for a moment, as this was the first time she had tried on such an expensive outfit. At that very moment, the Duke entered their room and called Hannah. He sighed heavily as he knew that it was simply impossible to stop her. He asked the maid if this was really what he wanted to tire her out by whining to the lady before she even started. Hannah apologized to the Duke for detaining the young lady. The Duke looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that the outfit suited her very well. She looked away from him shyly and suggested that he go on his way. Some time later, they came to the horse. She was surprised that they would ride on horseback and not in a carriage, because unfortunately, she didn't know how to ride a horse. Fenric walked closer to the young lady and asked for forgiveness for his next actions. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was going to do. At that very moment, Fenric mounted his horse next to her and announced that it was time for them to leave. Fenric looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was afraid of the horse, since he learned that it was her first time riding one. But the young lady was very embarrassed by such closeness, but still with a trembling voice, she said that everything was fine. A moment later, they set off for the city. She froze for a moment in admiration when she saw the beautiful evening city. She looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if this was really his wish. He smiled and asked if she remembered the festival he had spoken of earlier, where merchants from different countries gather and flower flags are flown. Fenric said with a smile that this was his long-time wish because he really wanted to enjoy this festival with her. She froze for a moment because she did not expect to hear anything like that. A few seconds later, a passing man accidentally pushed her, and she fell into the Duke's arms. The young man was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. The Duke looked closely at the young lady while hugging her and asked if she was okay. Persepe was very embarrassed by this. At that very moment, she pulled away from the Duke and, asking for forgiveness, said that everything was fine with her. He smiled and said that they should hold hands because there were a lot of people at the festival and they could lose each other. Some time later, they were walking through the night market Persepe, visiting each shop with admiration. She was happy because it was the first time she tried various delicacies. Persepe sincerely enjoyed the beautiful music, which she had never heard before. She was surprised and wondered when she had last been so happy. But now she was truly happy. But at that very moment, she turned around, because it seemed to her that someone was watching them. She reached out to the Duke and called him. The Duke froze for a moment and looked intently at his companion. After some time, the young lady approached the girl who was selling flowers. She looked at her with a smile and called out, and also asked if they could buy flowers. The young girl was taken aback, as she expected someone to approach her. At that very moment, the Duke paid the girl money and said that she should give him all the flowers that she had. She was shocked because he gave a lot of money, but at that very moment, they saw joy in her eyes and confusion on her face. After some time, they were walking leisurely through the city. The Duke looked closely at his companion and said that the mansion's garden was full of flowers. Persepe looked at the Duke with a smile and said that she knew about it, but she also wanted to buy all the flowers so that the child could go home early. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she still hadn't changed. Persepe understood perfectly well that something could have happened, something irreparable, and the game could have restarted, but she still wanted to keep the memories of this moment forever. The Duke tenderly embraced his companion and invited her to go further to explore the market. At that very moment, they heard a loud roar. Fenric, with lightning speed, pulled the young lady towards him and hugged her tightly while he looked around because he did not know where the loud sound was coming from. But a moment later, he ran away and looked at the sky in surprise. At that very moment, he became convinced that it was just fireworks. He released the young lady and informed her that it was just fireworks and nothing more. But after a few seconds, he turned his gaze to the young lady, who was very pale, and at the same time, she was trembling very much with fear. She was breathing heavily and could not stop as fear coursed through her veins. Fenric was stunned by this. He shouted and called for the young lady, but it was all in vain. She sighed heavily and said that she was simply scared. Fenric looked at her closely and asked if she was okay, and at the same time, he suggested that she return to the mansion. She sighed heavily and said that she was fine. The Duke asked worriedly if she had a chest pain. She was taken aback because she realized that most likely this was a habit from her past life, because she unconsciously grabbed his hand and pressed it to her chest. A moment later, she looked at the Duke with a smile and said that she was fine. She was just scared. He sighed heavily and looked at her closely, as he did not like this situation at all, because he knew what she had to go through. A moment later, the Duke suggested that the young lady take a short walk, as he wanted to find a quieter place where they could rest. After some time, they were sitting in a beautiful park. Persepe was momentarily taken aback by the beautiful sight, as she had no idea that there was such a place in the capital. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He sighed heavily and said that he had often visited this park as a child. He smiled and asked if she remembered that he had told her recently that he was a commoner. She sighed heavily and said that she remembered it. Fenric told his companion that he had secretly run away and came to this park. He was always begging and stealing, but on the days of the festival, like that child who sold flowers. But that day, he was lucky enough to steal a wallet from a rich merchant. In a trembling voice, she asked him to come back. She said that if she came empty-handed again today, she would be in trouble. He sighed heavily and looked at her intently, because he knew that either they were stealing money for street thugs or they were getting beaten up, and the only food they were getting was something that would soon spoil. He was puzzled because he was tired of all this. After some time, he bought a small loaf of bread and gave it to his girlfriend, and also asked her not to worry, because he would sort everything out himself. Unfortunately, they didn't earn a penny that day, and that same evening, he received from the elders. The man looked at the young man with anger, because he did not understand how he dared to deceive him, because he saw that he had silver coins. Filled with anger and rage, the man shouted at the young man to immediately give him all the money. Fenric shouted that his money had been stolen. The man was unhappy with this answer, and shouted that he would beat him half to death so that he would finally understand that lying is not good. The man was very angry and took out all his anger on the boy. After several long minutes, the man told the young man that if he did not sell the flowers, he and his sister would be sold into slavery. Fenric was confused and lost as he realized that he was simply existing, and his life was like the survival of a vile insect. At that very moment, he raised himself up and looked intently into the distance as he saw beautiful lights in the distance. He sighed heavily because he knew that there was no God and he was now in real hell. Fenric sat quietly in a dirty alley, shedding tears. He was furious because he had assumed that he was born only for such suffering, and at the same time, he thought that it would have been better not to have been born at all. But a moment later, he heard someone's voice. At that very moment, he saw a beautiful young lady. She smiled tenderly and asked if the flowers were for sale. She said that she would like to buy all the flowers if he did not mind. The young man looked at her with a longing look because he did not know who she was. He saw that she was wearing an expensive outfit, and a simple person could not afford such an outfit. He saw her beautiful snow-white skin, which had not known hard work. He saw her perfectly, and her shiny long hair. He understood that she was grown like a hothouse flower, and at the same time, she lived in a completely different world. At that very moment, the young man stood up and told the young lady not to clean up, calling her a spoiled aristocrat. Persephone was puzzled and asked him not to say such words, because she saw that he was wounded, and the young lady reached out to him, but he pushed her away. He looked at her with fury and shouted at her to stop pretending and leave immediately. She froze in place for a moment as she was surprised by this. But a moment later, the young lady handed him a whole bag of gold coins and told him not to have it, for he hid it until the man who looked like a bandit saw the money. Fenric was taken aback because he did not understand what she was doing at all. Persephone smiled and asked for forgiveness because she wanted to give him more, but this was all she had. She smiled and said that this was all her savings. At that very moment, she said that it was time for her to go since they were already waiting for her. Persephone looked intently at the young man and said that something important would soon happen in her life, so she would not need money, and therefore it seemed to her that he needed it more. She sighed heavily and said that he had nothing to defend himself with. So at that very moment, she handed him a beautiful little dagger. Persephone said with a smile that this dagger was left by her mother, and she thought it was quite valuable. Looking at the young man, she said that it would be more useful to him than to her, because she didn't even know how to use it. Fenric froze in shock, not understanding what was going on at all. Persephone sighed heavily and said that she would soon no longer need him, because whatever she did here would no longer matter. Persephone looked closely at the young man and said that it was the first time she had spoken to anyone here. It was just the first time she had seen a person with the same expression on his face. The young lady looked at her young companion closely and asked him to promise her that he would live happily. He froze, not understanding what was going on at all. She smiled and said that when she thought about it, she felt like she too could hold out a little longer. He looked after her in surprise because he did not understand what kind of girl was in front of him. Then he thought and wondered what kind of misfortunes a spoiled aristocrat could have. That day, their meeting was fateful, and it greatly changed the life of the young man. That day, a true purpose appeared in his life, because he wanted to meet the young savior of his soul again. He sincerely wanted to talk to her, for the sake of the young lady he killed and shed blood. He tried and climbed higher and higher. He even got involved in political intrigues against his will. And it was all for her, for a fleeting meeting with her. And yet after some time, he managed to meet the young lady. He was glad because he was able to see her. Persephone was taken aback and stopped when she heard the boy's voice. She looked at the boy in surprise as she thought that their conversation was already over. He looked at her intently and said menacingly that he would definitely repay her debt, and she should just wait for that moment. She was surprised, but still agreed to accept the debt with a gentle smile. Fenric sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that, and with the sole purpose of repaying the debt to the young beautiful girl. He reached this place. Persephone sighed heavily as she was surprised by his story. A moment later, she plucked up her courage and asked if he had repaid the debt to Tom, the important man. At that very moment, the Duke reached closer to the young lady and quietly whispered in her ear that he was trying to do it. She pulled away from him and said embarrassedly that she understood everything. Persephone was very excited since he had frightened her with his unexpected closeness. The Duke looked at his companion with a gentle smile and asked her not to worry. He assured her that she was not alone now, because she now had him and Hannah, and he knew that everything would be fine with her. Persephone was confused by the Duke's words. She did not understand why. When he spoke, her soul became calm. He looked at her intently and said that perhaps someday she would be glad that he was next to her. She was taken aback and threw all her thoughts away, but at the same time, she told the Duke that now she was very grateful that he was next to her. Some time later, they returned to the evening city. Persephone now, she felt much better. Her fright had passed, but she was still very embarrassed by their closeness because he did not let go of her hand. The Duke looked at his companion with a smile and invited her to move. She smiled and agreed with him. Perseppe was puzzled as she found this situation very strange, since until now in the game, physical contact had only caused disgust. Fenric looked closely at the young lady as he saw that she was embarrassed. He held her hand tenderly, but he himself was filled with anger and fury as she could not even imagine how much he wanted to kill those men. To protect her fragile hand, she didn't know how he hated himself for being able to only watch her die. To prevent anyone from touching her, he did everything he could on his part. He understood that if she knew about his desire to draw his sword and cut them apart, she would not look at him with such beautiful and kind eyes. He knew she would be horrified by who he really was. Sometime later, the Duke, smiling, informed his companion that they had arrived. She was surprised and did not understand where they had come. He smiled and said that they had come to the altar, where they were making a wish to the god of the festival. Fenric, looking at his companion, said that this was the last stage of the celebration. Although it was superstitious, he asked if she would like to come up and make an offering. The young lady smiled and agreed, and a few minutes later she stood at the altar making a wish. She prayed and asked the Almighty to return her to reality. At the same time, the Duke was closely watching the young lady. He was interested in what she was praying for. He looked at her intently and wondered if she had just asked the Almighty not to die anymore. At that moment, the young lady smiled and said that she hoped his wish would also come true. He sighed heavily because he knew that everything would be exactly like this, because he intended to arrange everything himself at any cost, no matter what. Sometime later, as they were returning back to the mansion, the Duke looked at his companion with a smile and asked if she enjoyed the festival. She smiled and said that she liked everything because she hadn't walked for a long time, and the walk was wonderful. Fenric looked at his companion with a tender smile as he was glad that she liked everything. At the same time, the young man slowly approached the altar and destroyed the flowers that the young lady had recently placed on the altar. He understood perfectly well what wish she had made, because she wanted to get out of the game as quickly as possible. He wondered if she was really that naive. He understood that her wish would never come true, since she would never be able to escape from the cursed game. The next day, the Duke, with a smile, led the young lady into the extensive library and informed her that she could look through it as much as she liked. Perseppe froze in shock when she saw the beautiful and large library. She knew that even just looking at the history books would take a long time. She knew that with such a volume, there could be information about the Forbidden Forest and information about the statues in the church. She knew that the bandits wouldn't just destroy the statue and assumed there was some reason. Fenric showed the extensive map a moment later to the young lady she had spoken of earlier. She froze for a moment when she saw the Empire map. She was amazed and could see that the Empire was huge. Fenric told the young lady that when the situation stabilizes a bit, it would be nice if they went on a trip together. She froze when he hugged her and started saying such words. At that very moment, he pulled away from her and said that it was time for him to go, because his palace had urgently called him. As he left, he asked her to enjoy the view. Perseppe breathed a sigh of relief as he had scared her greatly, and she was confused by his actions. Perseppe was puzzled as he suddenly came very close to her. She wondered if he had started touching her more often, because he had relaxed. Perseppe looked closely at the map, as what worried her most right now was the Forbidden Forest. She didn't know why, but it seemed familiar to her, although it was not mentioned in the story. Wondering if it really said in Siegfried's Loop. Unfortunately, she couldn't remember anything. But at that very moment, she froze in place as memories of her mother came flooding back to her. She was puzzled as she did not understand why she suddenly remembered that time. But at that very moment, she froze in place from shock and fear as she heard Ivan's voice, who with a predatory grin asked if something was bothering her. Ivan looked at the young lady with a predatory grin and greeted her. Perseppe looked at the young man with fury and fear, because she knew that it was not yet time for his visit. At that very moment, the maids burst into their room. They shouted at the great magician that he had behaved very ugly because he had burst into the room where he met the young lady. He bowed with a smile and said that he was very glad to meet her. Perseppe looked closely at the young man, as she had already seen her options in the notification window. She could slap him, pour water on him, or kiss him as a greeting. Perseppe was shocked because she saw these options. She did not know what to choose. Perseppe knew perfectly well that she would rather pour water on him than hit him in the face. After a few seconds, she plucked up her courage and splashed tea in his face. The maids froze in shock as they did not expect this. The young man froze for a moment. And at that very moment, a dead silence hung between them. Persepe casually apologized and said that her hand had slipped by accident. At that very moment, she saw a notification about the great magician's sympathy. Ivan, in turn, looked at her with cold fury, but did not answer. Ivan sighed heavily and said that it looked like her hand had not just slipped, but that she intended to splash him. He noticed that she was more aggressive than she seemed at first glance. Wiping the tea from his clothes, he informed the young lady that he had something to say to her, and at the same time, he asked her to send away the maids. Persepe firmly said that she had nothing to say to him, but Ivan told her that their conversation would concern her mother. She was taken aback, as she had not expected such a thing. Ivan looked at her with a sly grin and asked if she wanted to change her mind now. She first met Ivan after the prison incident. It was at the main holiday of the empire, namely the day of its foundation. The young ladies looked at the young lady with mockery and disdain, as they did not expect her to be at the party, as they thought she was already dead. They had mocked her and said that she was a princess without a title, and now that they saw her fawning on the emperor, they said with disdain that she was simply pathetic. At the same time, they did not spare her and mocked her in every possible way. When the young lady spilled it on her, she asked for forgiveness with a smirk, as she had not noticed her at all. Persepe was puzzled because she could not respond to their mockery in any way, and at the same time, she heard their bright laughter, the victorious ones. And at that fateful moment, she saw a young man. She froze for a moment when she saw him looking at her with a gentle and kind smile. When he used his magic, the young lady who had recently bullied poor Persepe was wounded. At that very moment, Ivan grabbed the young lady by the hand and angrily asked her if he should kill those girls who had previously bullied her. He looked at her intently, moving closer, and said that she could just ask him, but she would have to cry, and he could do whatever she told him to do. Persepe sighed heavily as these memories flooded her, and fear crippled her fragile body. She didn't even want to remember her past life, as he was a monster who didn't spare her. Unfortunately, he was the most dangerous of all the main characters. Plucking up her courage, the young lady looked at him intently and asked what he wanted to talk about. Ivan looked at her with a satisfied grin. He looked at her with a predatory grin, admiring her, since this was unexpected for him, because in front of him now was a woman who was obsessed with the emperor himself. He thought that she was just a stupid and weak fool, but he noticed that she had character. He was alarmed and did not understand why she was bothering him so much. At that very moment, he asked with a grin what she knew about the Forbidden Forest. Persepe was stunned by his words. She was excited and didn't understand why he was asking her about this. He smiled and said that she probably knew that the Forbidden Forest was a lair for monsters. He smiled and said that when he was studying magic, he often received different messages. He was informed that half-breeds, the descendants of humans and monsters, often lived in the trees near the forest. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected to hear something like that. Ivan asked, with a predatory grin, if she was really interested. He told the young lady that monsters exist only to kill people. Also among them, occasionally, there were individuals who fell in love with people. Persepe was puzzled and did not understand why he was telling her something like that. He looked at her intently and said that her mother was from those parts near the forest before coming to the palace. She froze in shock and wondered if it was true. He said that monsters strive to protect their own, even if they are half-breed mutants. He knew that mysterious murders committed by monsters continued in the capital. He looked at her intently and told her that she was very lucky to use this as an excuse to leave the palace. With a haughty look, he said that she was still lucky. Persepe looked at the young man with fury and said that she was an ordinary person and all his assumptions were unfounded. He looked at her with a grin, and at that very moment, he said that he knew that the Grand Duke had taken her away on purpose. He approached her, and with a predatory grin, said that she would be much better off under his protection. Persepe was taken aback and furiously asked what he was doing. He said that mutants were monsters, an excellent subject for research. So he invited her to come to him, while he grabbed her by the waist and pulled her closer to the family. Persepe was furious and pushed him away at that very moment. But the great magician only looked at her with a fierce grin. She was furious and didn't understand what he was even allowing himself to do. But at the same time, fear from past lives washed over her. He smiled and said that while looking through the records in the tower, he discovered something else interesting. He said that her mother, the Empress, entered the Forbidden Forest before becoming a concubine. Persepe froze in place, and memories of the conversation with her mother came flooding back when her mother told her that she had to go to the forbidden forest. As he left, Ivan told the young lady with a grin that he would wait for her visit. After some time, the emperor held a meeting, and at the meeting, the high priest furiously asked those present if the murders were connected with the decrease in the number of monsters. He furiously asked if the monsters had secretly entered their city. He shouted furiously that the dwindling number of monsters in the forest was thanks to the knightly order. He couldn't understand how they dared to doubt their glory. The young man sighed heavily and said that their magic tower was the one that knew the most about the monsters in the forest, unlike the knights who only waved balls. He said that they needed to send a research team into the forest to find out if anything unusual had happened there. For some time, the Duke watched intently all those present and their quarrels. He was furious because he genuinely didn't understand what he was doing at the meeting. At the same time, Ivan was slowly returning back with a satisfied grin, since he had not experienced such interest for a long time. He was excited because he knew that if the prophecy was to be believed, the young lady was definitely somehow connected to all this. He knew she was strange, but he didn't know who she was, so he wondered if she was a mutated monster. He said with a predatory grin that it didn't matter to him who she really was, because when she fell into his hands, he would find out everything. He understood that to do this, he needed to remove the obstacle in all the roads in the form of the Grand Duke. Ivan understood that the young man was too sensitive to everything that concerned the young lady. He knew that the Grand Duke would not let her go just like that. At that very moment, he thought about the captain of the knights. After all, Toth recently wanted to send knights to a village near the forest, because he knew that depending on the results of the investigation, they might request help from the mages from the tower. Ivan knew that the young man was talking about sending an investigative team to the nearest village. At that very moment, he called his assistant. He said that he thought it would be best to explore the inside of the forbidden forest. The young man looked at his master in surprise. Ivan casually handed over the documents and asked the young man to prepare a meeting with the church. Ivan looked intently at his assistant as he wanted to tell him something else. He smiled a predatory grin and asked if the Grand Duke was currently in the mansion. He knew that since the Emperor's health was not important at the moment, it was better to discuss this matter with the Duke. He was glowing with anticipation of meeting his young lady, since he had already managed to remove the Grand Duke from sight. He understood that while everyone was busy, he would get the young lady into his net through the investigation. At that very moment, he slowly returned to himself with a satisfied grin, but after a few seconds, his grin disappeared from his face as he heard someone else's voice. He turned around because he didn't know who greeted him, but at that very moment, to his regret, he was caught in the net of his adversary. The young man furiously grabbed the Grand Duke by the throat and squeezed him with all his strength. Fenric was seething with anger and asked the young man how he dared to break into someone else's mansion. He shouted that his manner was not in keeping with his position. Ivan froze for a moment and trembling asked the Grand Duke what he meant, since he had come to investigate a murder. And nothing more, but to his regret, he could not even move from the spot, since the Duke held him with a dead grip. At that very moment, an unprecedented fear spread through his veins as the Grand Duke pointed the tip of his sword straight at his eye. Fenric looked at the young man with cold fury and malice and told him not to even think about the young lady. He shouted at the great mage to stay away from her. Fenric told Ivan that if he came closer to her, he would show him how he wielded the sword with which he had risen to his current position. In turn, Ivan froze in place from shock, and his eyes filled with uncontrollable fear. A few seconds later, the Grand Duke released the young man, who sat on the ground breathing heavily. After a few seconds, he came to his senses and looked at the Duke with fury, but he also noticed that the Duke's words were very bold. He asked the Grand Duke with fury, did he really dare to threaten him? Ivan was burning with anger and fury as the great Duke threatened the great magician of the Empire without any good reason. Fenric looked at him with cold fury and said that he would think about the reasons after he gutted him like a stray dog. Ivan looked at the Duke with fury. So I understood that he was simply crazy, but he did not intend to simply leave the actions of the Grand Duke alone. At that very moment, Ivan also used all his strength against the Duke and threatened himself with a spell. He created malice and looked at the Duke as if he wanted to tear him to shreds with his mental magic. But after a few seconds, he was taken aback and froze in shock. He was stunned, as he didn't understand what had happened at all, and wondered why his magic had dissipated. He was truly shocked as he noticed that his magic had no effect on the Duke. At that very moment, he saw the Duke in a terrible and furious guise, and at the same time, he was surrounded by dark magic. Ivan was very frightened because he saw that the Grand Duke's magic was much superior to his own magic. He was shocked by what he saw and did not understand who the Duke really was. Fenric sighed heavily as he knew that he would have to kill the Great Mage anyway, and so he intended to do it earlier. Ivan was shocked and asked the Duke to stop, but it was all in vain. But at that very moment, they both looked away as they saw a young man who was calling his master. The young man shouted to Ivan that he needed to go to the magic tower immediately. He shouted to Ivan that he himself had said earlier that he would report on the meeting. The Duke sighed heavily since he had not been able to deal with the Great Mage. And at that very moment, he turned around and walked away, leaving them alone. The young man ran up to his master and hurriedly asked if everything was all right with him. Ivan was burning with rage because he understood that the psychopath had almost killed him. Many years ago, a mysterious death occurred in the slums. Namely, the leader of a gang was killed by someone, and no one could think that it was a little boy who did it. 5 years later, rumors began to spread about a war demon. He brought a miraculous victory to the empire, and people began to call him a hero. The young man attended various events, where young ladies looked at him with admiration. But at one of the celebrations, he overheard a conversation between young ladies who were discussing the abandoned princess because they did not understand why the emperor left her alive. But they assumed that he took pity on her since she was too weak and harmless. They also knew that the princess had previously been close to Prince Dietrich, so they assumed that when the prince became emperor, he would take her back. At that time, the Grand Duke swore allegiance to the weak prince who had no right to the throne. He wanted to take this path because he hoped to meet the young lady. Almost 10 years passed after he swore allegiance to the prince, and then he managed to meet a young lady who was captured and brought to his castle. Then the prince looked at her with rage and ordered the knights to throw her into prison. But after that, he changed his mind and ordered them to lock her at the top of the tower. He looked at her with fury and said that he would personally torture her. Fenric in turn was taken aback as he did not expect such a thing. He was shocked by everything that was happening because he understood that something had gone wrong, and that day he began to understand it. He knew that she was tortured almost every day. Her screams were deafening to his ears. He was furious with himself and did not understand why he made a scoundrel emperor. He did not understand why he met her then. At the coronation celebration on that very fateful day, the Duke stopped when he saw a young lady in the distance. He was taken aback and froze looking at her as she stood motionless. Looking at her, he realized that something was wrong. He came closer to her because he did not understand what she was doing. But at that very moment, he was taken aback because he saw that she simply jumped into the water. He was furious and shouted at her, but it was all in vain. At that very moment, he rushed to her water because he knew that he had a lot to tell her. He wanted to say that he came to see her. Fenric was excited and surprised as she herself threw herself into the water. And unfortunately, he couldn't do anything about it. At that moment, he was devastated and didn't know what to do now. He was furious because he saw that she was dead. But at that very moment, he saw some bright light. And a moment later, he opened his eyes and saw that he was on a battlefield. He was excited because he realized that he was back on the battlefield of 2 years ago. Fenric was taken aback as he realized that it was a dream. He did not understand where the young lady was now, but he knew that every time she was killed, he returned to the battlefield again and again. Then, he finally realized that they were trapped in an endless loop. What enveloped her body at the moment of death was a connecting link for them. He understood that it was because of this that he was doomed to see her death again and again. He did not know whether it was a curse or a chance. In the bedroom in the garden, sometimes just by blinking, he opened his eyes and found himself in the middle of a battlefield, and then he realized that she had been unjustly killed somewhere again. Every death was imprinted on his memory and on his body. He knew all the men who had pushed her to a terrible death. Fenric knew that when they appeared, his body seemed to go numb, as if someone was controlling him, and all he could do was console her with small signs of attention. When he saw so many deaths that he couldn't count them, he finally decided to pull her out of this loop. Unfortunately for him, the chance came very rarely because his body turned to stone, obeying an invisible force. And to his regret, he could only watch each time. And after all this, he accidentally met a young man. The young man looked at the Grand Duke with a fierce grin and said that he was doing funny things. He had to breathe air into his legs and informed the Duke that he could not get to them. He told the Duke that he was not the main character here. He told the Duke that this world was created only for the young lady, and therefore she must suffer and die over and over again. Fenric was stunned by what he heard. He asked the unexpected guest what he was talking about. The young man smiled and told the Duke that if she had not given him the dagger on a whim, he would not even be breathing now. He looked at the Duke with a grin and asked what it was like to break free from his predetermined destiny. Fenric froze for a moment, not understanding who was in front of him. The young man smiled and asked the Duke if he wanted to change his fate. He came closer to the Duke and quietly said that he must kill all the men who surrounded her. As he left, he patted the young man on the shoulder and said that he should simply take their place. He looked at the Grand Duke intently and with a smirk said that he should simply take away their rights. Fenric froze in place, as if rooted to the spot. He did not understand what was happening at all, and what the young man was saying. He smiled and said to the Duke that he was an anomaly that went beyond the rules of this world. One could say that he was a being that was like a singularity point. He said with a predatory grin that it was the day he first saw the death of a young lady that he became free from any interference. He also informed the Duke that if the men disappeared, he could take their place without any restrictions. The Duke froze for a moment from the juice and wondered if he could get close to the young lady in this way. He really wanted to just talk to her. He wanted to touch her with all his heart. Fenric wanted to save her and take her into his arms. He looked closely at his young companion as he realized what he had to do. The young man smiled and, extending his hand to the Duke, asked what he would say to this. At that very moment, he said with a predatory grin that he would certainly help him achieve his goal. Fenric slowly but surely cut short the men's fates and knocked them out of the way. He made them wander, confusing them, and then he removed the man who had led him astray. He was sure that he was doing everything right because he understood that in this way he could take their place. That day, he decided to voluntarily surrender his fate. Fenric did not regret his choice at all, but he did not know what the young lady would say if she learned of such a thing. He wondered if she would welcome being freed from the shackles of suffering, or on the contrary, she would have despised his hands, which were stained with blood. He did not know whether she would have been afraid of his obsession, but now he knew perfectly well that he didn't care. After all, he just wanted to be near her. Fenric really wanted her to make a wish because he intended to fulfill everything she wished for. But at the same time, he wanted only one thing, for her to stay with him. At the same time, the great magician was burning with rage and malice. He did not understand how the great Duke managed to do something like this to him. He understood perfectly well that he would not leave something like this alone, but he was still puzzled because he did not know what power the great Duke had, since his power exceeded even the power of the great magician. He was amazed that a creature with such magical power was on the continent, but he knew that only one precedent had previously had such power, but it had been destroyed long ago. He sighed heavily and wondered if the Grand Duke was really like that, but he put all his thoughts aside more easily, since he knew that he, the Duke, was a man. He understood that the young lady was most likely involved in this, since she was supposed to be the half-breed of a demon. Everyone who had met her before had died one after another, for inexplicable reasons. Even knew that a demon had suddenly appeared in the center of the capital. He thought for a moment and froze in place as everything was more familiar to him. A moment later, he descended into the underground library. Ivan knew that all cases with demons should be recorded in the magic tower. He knew that there had been cases of rare demons before, so he assumed that he would find clues in half-breed demons. Looking at the documents, he was irritated because the documents were too old, and it was difficult for him to read. He sighed heavily, as he wanted to find at least something, but a moment later, he sneezed as if there was a lot of dust from the documents. He was puzzled since the documents were scattered everywhere. Ivan knew that he needed to immediately gather all his subordinates so that they could do a general cleaning. But at that very moment, he looked back as he noticed some parchment on the ground. He was surprised because he came across historical records, and he sighed heavily because he knew that he had already put all the historical books in the corner. But at that very moment, he saw the Book of Prophecies and froze in place. After some time, the young man was looking for his master in a hurry. The young man was puzzled and did not know where his master was. But a moment later, he finally found Ivan. He looked at the gentleman in surprise as he was worried about something. He looked at Ivan hastily and asked what he had found. At that very moment, Ivan said with a fierce grin that he had found a way to separate the Duke from the young lady. Some time later, Persepa slowly opened her eyes. She pulled herself up and sighed heavily, but she was still glad that she had slept well. After a few seconds, she shuddered and looked at the Grand Duke with embarrassment, as she did not expect to see him. She was very embarrassed and asked him how long he had been in her room. Precep froze as his appearance was unexpected. He slowly sat up and, sighing heavily, said that she had been fast asleep, and so he had decided to just sit next to her, but since she had woken up, he intended to leave. Precep was taken aback and looked after him in surprise, since she had not said at all that he should leave. A moment later, she reached out to him and grabbed his hand. The Duke froze with surprise on his face, as he did not expect anything like this from the young lady. At that very moment, she said shyly that he could stay. The Duke was stunned. He wanted this more than anything, but he didn't expect that she would suggest it herself. A moment later, a sweet awkwardness reigned between them. He sighed heavily and said that he heard that the great magician had frightened her yesterday. Fenric looked closely at his young companion and said that it was his fault, and he should have taken better care of the guards. Precep was taken aback and said that this was not true and that nothing terrible had happened at all. But after a few seconds, she became lost in thought and wondered if she should tell him everything. Precep hesitated, but still called the Duke, because she was determined to tell him everything. The Duke, sitting next to the young lady, held back his emotions after her story. As he heard that the great magician dared to order her to come to him, she sighed heavily and said that Ivan said that he could help. Precep was a little surprised and did not understand why she was being frank, telling him everything she understood, that it would be better for her not to mention the half-breeds. Fenric was burning with anger and fury, as he knew he should have killed him earlier. The Duke sighed heavily and called the young lady. Fenric looked closely at the young lady and asked if she would like to go to Ivan. Several hundred years ago, a sage left behind a book of prophecies, namely the source of the demons that still existed in the forest. At that very moment, Ivan read about this creature, eternally sleeping but never asleep. He could die, but was also unable to live. But only one thing could save him: the creature, which is neither a demon nor a man, until it finds him, will suffer living an illusory life again and again. Ivan was surprised as he read about the creature that it was neither a demon nor a human. He understood that this creature's life had been interrupted hundreds of times, and hundreds of times she was reborn, despite everything. But after 5 fruits he will finally find him. Until then, he cannot find peace. This being cannot end its suffering. He simply remains silent forever until the being finds him. Ivan read a story about an ancient demon that had long been the stuff of legend. He realized that it was undoubtedly a story about a demon king. That being neither a demon nor a human was right in front of him for a while, because the only thing that came to his mind was the young lady. He understood that if this was true, then the statue in the church and the legend of the hero who pacified the demon king were all lies. Ivan sighed heavily as he now understood why these documents were hidden deep in the tower. He understood that if this became known, the entire country would be turned upside down. But right now, he didn't care at all. He looked into the distance with a fierce grin, because he knew that this information could be very useful to him. Precep was taken aback and froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. The Duke realized that if she wanted to free herself from the Emperor, then perhaps Ivan would be more useful than he, because with the help of magic, one could easily send a person to another country. Precep looked at the young man with a tender smile and said that she wanted to stay with him and did not want to go anywhere. Precep looked at the Grand Duke with embarrassment and said that he and Hannah were here, and she liked this place because she could sleep peacefully at night without worries. The Duke froze for a moment, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He was glad of such words from the young lady, and she in turn looked away in embarrassment as she felt awkward after such words. At that very moment, she looked at the Duke as she saw that he was a little embarrassed and had a beautiful smile on his face. The Duke smiled and said that he was very glad to hear such a thing. Precep was very embarrassed by his beautiful expression. She turned her embarrassed gaze away from him and hid her heart, which was ready to jump out of her chest. She knew before that he was handsome, but now he appeared before her in a completely different light. Fenric looked at the young lady intently and said in all seriousness that the founding celebration would soon be held. She was taken aback, as she had not expected him to immediately change the subject. He sighed heavily and said in all seriousness that the Emperor's health was not important now, but the event was very important and they should be present at it. Frankly, he wanted to prevent this in any way he could, because he understood that it would be the same violence as what some people did to him. Fenric didn't want her to go to the party at all. He didn't want her to meet them. The lady sighed heavily, as she did not want to go to the party at all. She knew full well that this was one of the few major royal events, and aristocrats rarely had the opportunity to see so many people in one place. She understood that she could most likely meet the real protagonist at the festival. Besides, she was aware of the fact that a long time had passed since she abandoned the system, so she needed to go to the tower and check the system. After some time of much thought, she told the Duke that she would go to the party. He sighed heavily and said that he understood her. At that very moment, she smiled and asked if the Duke would go with her, as she was a little afraid to go alone. She looked at him with a radiant smile and asked if he would go with her. He froze for a moment, not prepared for such a question. But at that very moment, he agreed with a smile and said that he would follow her wherever she went. On the founding day, the young lady was assembled, and Hannah, with a radiant smile, praised the lady. Persephone, in turn, was a little confused by the words of her maid. Hannah smiled and shouted that she knew it would look perfect on the beautiful lady. She shouted that this outfit was really the best in the empire. The young lady, in turn, noticed that the festive outfits had not changed because she was worried that something would go wrong due to mistakes. A few minutes later, the Duke came out and asked the maid not to bother the young lady so much. At that very moment, the girls turned their attention to the handsome Duke. Hannah sighed heavily and perfumed her beautiful sweet cheeks, said that she was not bothering him at all, and asked the Duke to look at the young lady as she was shining with beauty. The Duke came closer to his companion and froze for a moment from shock as he was struck by her beauty. He looked away from her embarrassed and said that she really was shining so much, so that he was even sorry to show her to others. Persephone froze in place with embarrassment, as she did not expect such words from the Duke. Some time later, the young people arrived at the celebration. The Duke informed his companion that there was still time before the beginning of the celebration, and they could rest a little in the carriage. She was taken aback, as she realized that now was the time to go to the tower. At that very moment, she told the Duke that she needed to leave for a while. He looked at her in surprise as he didn't understand where she wanted to go. She smiled and said that she seemed to have forgotten some clothes in the tower. She thought for a moment, as even she could see that this was a lame excuse. At that very moment, the Duke said that he would go with her, since it was dangerous for her to walk alone. Persephone was taken aback and told the Duke that there was no need for that. She understood that if he went with her, some error might occur in calling the system. The Duke looked at his companion with concern and asked what was wrong with her. She sighed heavily and asked him to take her only to the entrance, as she wanted to take a quick look inside the tower. Sometime later, the young lady still managed to visit her room. She froze for a moment when she saw the dark and cramped room. She did not understand how she had lived in such a place before, because she knew that only a little time had passed since moving to the Duke's residence, and her former home already seemed far away. She looked around, hoping there was no one nearby. After a few seconds, she finally called the system, as she wanted to look at the Book of Memories. Persephone sighed heavily, as she still could not see anything. Then she opened the event log with all the entries, including the training. She hoped that she would find some kind of clue there. For a moment she stared at the event log as it slowly loaded. She was surprised, and at the same time excited, because she did not understand what had happened and why the magazine did not show it. At that very moment, she heard some strange sound and saw an error unknown to her. She was furious and wanted the system to show her something else. A moment later, the system asked the young lady if she wanted to start with the learning mode of memories. She was glad that she was able to at least open something in places, and question marks appeared. She froze for a moment as she saw some memories. She saw an unfamiliar but beautiful forest, and thought that this was most likely the very beginning of her training. At that very moment, she froze, looking at the young, beautiful lady. She was puzzled. At that moment, memories came flooding back to her, and she remembered everything. She knew it was there at the very beginning when she first got into the game. She went to a nice lake and sat there for hours, but at the same time, she kept a record of it in her diary. But one day, while sitting at the entries, she heard some kind of rumble, and at the same time, she became very scared. Unfortunately, she got very scared and accidentally dropped her diary into the lake. Then, her only notebook, in which she wrote something, was lost forever in the depths of the lake. The young lady was alarmed, because she did not understand how she could have forgotten such an important thing. She remembered that there was information about the game. There were hints that she didn't remember now. She knew she had to check something, but unfortunately, she didn't know what. Persephone was screaming in a hurry and asking the system to show her what was happening next. She was furious because she saw that everything was getting worse and was throwing out error after error. A few seconds later, she saw a young man extend his hand to her, but she didn't know who it was or what happened, as she only saw 2 hands. And after this picture, the map no longer worked. The event log and memory viewing also didn't function. She was furious because she knew the mistake had started when she chose the odd answer for the prince. Then a bug appeared, and sympathy notifications turned into question marks, after which the young prince was found dead. She was puzzled because after the prince, the lord was also found dead. After this, the emperor asked if she wanted to leave the palace. She knew that the statue in the church had been destroyed. Precep was excited and lost in her thoughts. She wondered what if this was just the beginning. She was very worried because she saw that the errors were becoming more and more numerous. She wondered if the whole system could stop working completely. She understood that if everything was going like this, there was simply no point in looking for the main character. She sighed heavily because she actually knew that the system was already collapsing. She knew that the characters with errors were gaining memory and self-awareness. She didn't know what would happen when they all gained self-awareness. She was worried about what would happen when they remembered everything. The Duke looked at the young lady with concern, as she was very upset and worried about something. Precep was on edge and wondered if this was really just a mistake. She understood that, for now, she had to do what she could. She was aware of the fact that she needed to go to the forest, namely to visit the lake that was in her memories, because she understood that now this was her only clue. Some time later, the young people nevertheless visited the banquet hall and saw the emperor in a deplorable state. Precep looked closely at the emperor because she saw that he was truly ill, because he looked very bad. The emperor in turn met the gaze of his young lady. She quickly hid behind the duke as she felt uneasy. A few seconds later, she looked out from behind his back. She clearly saw Ivan in front of her, who was looking at her with a fierce grin. Precep was very angry because she saw that he had also decided to visit the palace, but she was a little surprised because she did not know what had happened to his neck. A few days ago, Ivan visited the emperor. The man informed the emperor that a great magician was requesting an audience. Ivan looked at the emperor with a predatory grin and said that he had urgent business. Ivan, in turn, looked at the young lady with a predatory grin because he knew that she should wait a little, because soon his plan for revenge would come true, and she would see everything with her own eyes. The young lady turned away from him and hid behind the duke's broad back as she felt uneasy. The duke looked closely at his companion and said that if she was uncomfortable, they could go out. He offered to accompany her. Precep looked at the duke with a tender smile and said that since he was next to her, everything would be fine. He said that this was true, but if she still felt discomfort, she should tell him immediately. The duke in turn felt uneasy. He was very angry and didn't want them to meet Ivan, although he knew that it didn't matter anymore. After all, today, seizing the moment, he will deal with the great magician. At that very moment, the emperor rose from his throne and looked intently at everyone present. He looked closely at all the inhabitants and congratulated them on the founding day of their empire. The emperor said that throughout their long history, their ancestors had defended these lands from people and monsters, and even recently, they had fought bravely, risking their lives to preserve the pride of the empire. He looked at them closely and said that he was very proud of them. However, he sighed heavily and said that there were still those who threatened their empire. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. The emperor sighed heavily and said that it was not just about people. He said that now was the time to prove their courage. She was surprised since he had never said such things before. The emperor looked closely at everyone present and said that he would witness their noble sacrifice. He said the valiant knights, the Holy Church, and the Magic Tower will act together. The duke in turn looked at the emperor with bewilderment. He knew that the emperor was known for his support of the church. He wondered if he had specifically mentioned the Magic Tower now. At the same time, the young lady looked around, hoping that the real protagonist would appear. Fenric looked closely at his companion and asked who she was looking out for so carefully. She shuddered as she was not prepared for such a question. The young lady was puzzled and did not know how to answer his question. She felt somehow awkward looking for the main character right in front of the Grand Duke. At that very moment, a young man approached them and greeted the young lady. She looked in surprise at the young man who was slowly approaching them. At that very moment, the young man informed the young lady that the emperor was waiting for her, and they were taken aback, as they had not expected such a thing. The young man bowed and informed the young lady that the emperor wanted to speak with her urgently. But at that very moment, the duke covered her with his powerful body. He looked at the knight with anger and told him to convey his apologies to his majesty, but the young lady was not well. She was very confused and surprised that he decided to protect her in this way. The young man was a little puzzled. He said that all these days, while the emperor was bedridden, he constantly asked about the young lady. He told her that if she could spend a little time with the emperor, he would feel much better. Precep was a little puzzled and didn't know if she should go. She knew that the emperor was the only person who had been with her from the very beginning, and she assumed that she would be able to learn something about her forgotten past. She knew that the most important thing was that now she was not alone, and she could boldly go to him. The Duke was surprised by her desire to see the emperor. In a hurry, he called Precep, as he was surprised by her actions, but she turned around with a smile and said that she would be back soon. Precep looked intently at the young man and asked where the emperor was now. After some time, the young man took the young lady to the emperor. Dietrich turned and looked at the young lady. He sighed heavily as he saw that she had arrived. Precep. Looking at the emperor, she noticed that the sympathy window was still the same, albeit with question marks. He sighed heavily and asked if she remembered this place. He said with sadness in his voice that they often played in the greenhouse when they were little and often picked flowers. She sighed heavily and said that she remembered it, and it was a lot of fun then. Precep looked closely at the emperor, as she had noticed when she left the palace. She saw that he had truly changed very much. Looking at the emperor, she wondered what he was like now, because she knew that he had now found himself, and she was interested in how he had changed. The emperor sighed heavily and said that lately he had been tormented by nightmares and that they were very painful dreams. The young lady was taken aback and, looking at the emperor, wondered if he was beginning to be visited by memories from his past lives. He sighed heavily and said that he thought about her every time. He said he was thinking about the time when her mother was alive, and when they were together before he took the throne. He knew they were secretly hiding in the garden. He sighed heavily and said that every time they left his mess in the library, she was taken aback and wondered if he was talking about that time she had forgotten. He smiled with his tenderness and said that they hid their status without fear and secretly ran away from the palace to festivals. She froze in shock on the spot, since she did not remember this. Precep asked with surprise in her voice if this was true, and at the same time, she asked the temperature to tell her everything in more detail. He sighed heavily and said that they dressed like common people, and at the same time examined the people's altars. But one of those days, she suddenly disappeared. Although he managed to find her quickly, even then, he was very scared. Precep thought for a moment and wondered if the hand she had seen earlier was the hand of the emperor. The emperor sighed and said that then she left him. He sighed heavily and told the young lady that when her mother died, he ran to her urgently. He was furious because he heard that she was to be executed. He wanted to beg his father not to do it. At that very moment, he started running. The butler wanted to stop him, but it was all in vain. The prince was puzzled because he could not allow his best friend to die. He burst into tears and prayed for her to stay alive, because he knew that even if he had to, he would kneel before the emperor. A few minutes later, he finally ran into the emperor's room. But he froze for a moment when he saw the men who started the conversation about the young lady. He froze and watched them intently and listened to their conversation. At that moment, he learned her secret and made a decision for himself. He understood that she could not go anywhere and that she had to remain safe in the palace. Dietrich knew perfectly well that he simply could not let her go. After some time, he burst into her room with a joyful smile. But at that very moment, he froze in place as he realized that she was not there. The prince saw chaos and disorder in the young lady's room. He could not bear it and burst into bitter tears. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he had been so blinded by the thought that she had escaped that he had seen nothing, and that he could not even imagine then that she had been driven out. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, he was blinded by his own anger. She was surprised, looked at her, and asked if he had really found out her secret. At that very moment, she asked him to tell her about this secret. Dietrich smiled and asked if she would then fulfill his request. The emperor froze for a moment and wondered if he really wanted to kill her. He didn't know if he was ever destined to kill her, but now he knew that it wouldn't happen. Dietrich looked at her intently and said that whoever she was, he could promise her that he would never harm her again and would do everything to make her happy all her life. For this reason, he asked her to return to the palace immediately. He wanted her to be by his side. He sighed heavily and said that he knew how terrible he had been to her and understood everything perfectly. The emperor was puzzled, for he knew that the way he kept her in the Western Tower, under the pretext of protection, was his selfish desire. At that very moment, he came closer to her and grabbing her by the fragile body, said that he promised her that he would never harm her again, so she should believe his words. She knew perfectly well what he would tell her, but she did not expect to see his eyes, which were filled with sadness. Precep saw that he was not trying to manipulate her clumsily. She saw eyes that were both sincere and at the same time asking for forgiveness. Precep understood perfectly well that it was perhaps even safer in the palace than outside. She sighed heavily and asked if she refused, she would not know this secret. At that very moment, she agreed, and the emperor beamed, for he was glad that she would stay. She looked at him intently and said that she refused the offer. Precep knew perfectly well that earlier she would have returned to him because she had no other choice. The Emperor of the Sucker looked at her and asked what she was talking about. She knew that now she did not need to go back. She sighed heavily and told the Emperor that if he really wanted her happiness, he should understand her and her decision. She looked him straight in the eyes and said that even if the wounds healed, the scars would still remain. At that very moment, he grabbed her fragile hand with fury and a strong grip. The Emperor was very angry and asked the young lady if this was all because of the Duke. Burning with anger, he asked if she really thought she would be safe with the Duke. He didn't understand why she trusted a man she barely knew so much. He shouted at her not to trust him too much. After all, even the Emperor himself didn't really know anything about the young man, and he hid a lot. He shouted to the young lady that the young man was much more dangerous than she could have imagined. He screamed furiously that she couldn't be near him, but at that very moment, the young lady said that she did not care, and at the same time she moved away from the Emperor. As she left, she said that even if she was unhappy or in danger, it would be the result of her choice. Dietrich froze in shock as he watched the young lady's trail. Dietrich reached out to her, but he was unable to stop her, as she was determined to leave him. The Emperor was puzzled, for he saw that the young lady had changed greatly, and that Precep was no longer the fragile girl who trembled with fear. He understood that in this case, he must go on the offensive. At that very moment, the Emperor called the knight. He looked at him sideways and said that they should proceed according to plan. At the same time, the Duke stood quietly waiting for the arrival of the young lady. He was worried because he knew he shouldn't have let her go alone. A few seconds later, he threw all his thoughts away as Ivan approached him and greeted him with a smirk. Ivan mockingly told the young man that he had heard earlier that such empty receptions were usually avoided here. The Duke in turn did not respond to the provocation. Ivan, with a smirk, asked if he should begin with gratitude, since thanks to the Grand Duke, he had gained a rather rare experience. He said with rage that there had never been any wounds on his precious body, but now he had a scar, and it was taking a very long time to heal. Fenric casually said that he was very sorry that everything turned out this way, and he still needed to cut off Ivan's head right away. At that very moment, the Duke said that it was amusing for him to watch such a pathetic swordsman grovel before him. Ivan looked at him with fury, but still restrained himself. He sighed heavily and said that it didn't matter at all. He, mocking the Duke, said that no matter how much he fought like a mad dog, he was just a sword in the hands of the Emperor. Ivan looked at his companion with a fierce grin and said that he was a sword that must bow if the Emperor ordered it. The Grand Duke looked closely at the young man and sensed a threat in his words, but he also sensed even during the Emperor's speech that he was plotting something. At that very moment, he turned around because he heard the familiar voice of the young lady. Fenric ran quickly to the young lady and asked if she was all right. She looked at him sheepishly and said that she was fine, but she still wanted to talk to him. At that very moment, they did not hear the Emperor's cries. They turned around. The young lady was a little puzzled because she didn't know what was going on at all. A few seconds later, the captain of the knights entered the hall along with his subordinates. A few minutes later, the commander of the knights knelt before the Emperor and said that, by his order, they were ready to march. The young lady was amazed and shocked by everything that was happening. She did not understand what was happening at all. Ivan watched everything that was happening with a predatory grin on his face. At that very moment, the Emperor shouted to everyone and announced that today, the Empire would begin a large-scale purge of monsters in the Forbidden Forest. He also angrily announced that the dear Duke Fenric would lead this expedition. Precep froze in shock. She was very puzzled and angry because she did not understand how the Emperor could do such a thing. She looked intently at the Grand Duke, for she understood that it was because of her that he had to go to the battlefield. She was alarmed and did not know what to do now, but at that very moment she saw a grin on his predatory face, but she also saw rage in his eyes. The Emperor looked at Ivan in surprise and asked if he was really talking about the Demon King now. Ivan said with a joyful grin that everything was exactly like that, and he suspected the Duke. The Emperor froze for a moment, unable to comprehend what was happening. Ivan smiled and said that, as he had said earlier, the person from this prophecy was probably young Lady Prisepe, and the one who suddenly appeared and swept across the battlefield like a whirlwind was none other than the Duke. And he instantly became a close and trusted person of the Emperor. And as soon as the murder took place, he approached the young lady. Unfortunately, its origin was unclear. Ivan knew that the most important thing was that the Duke had an inexplicable, overwhelming magical power, and such a being in this empire could only be a demon king or a creature similar to him. The Emperor froze in place in surprise as he understood that this was pure nonsense. However many years ago, he heard that the young lady was a half-breed child with the demons. He learned this when the men were talking. The man sighed heavily and said that according to this matter of his patronymic executing, her would be too wasteful, because she would be a good bait to catch the demon king. He froze in shock as he could not believe what he heard. He wondered if they had planned something similar for his friend. Now the Emperor was furious, as he realized that this information was too similar to what he had once heard. Ivan looked closely at the Emperor and wondered if he wasn't surprised that the young lady was a half-breed. He was surprised that the Duke was the king of demons. Ivan said that everything was according to the prophecy, and there were too many eyes in the empire to get rid of him since he enjoyed the trust of the people. At that very moment, the Emperor looked intently at the young man and said that he was entrusting him with cleaning the forest. He was sure that he had to separate the young lady from the Duke. Ivan looked at the Duke with a satisfied grin, for he knew that he had to separate him from the young lady, and then he would be able to take possession of her, for when she returned to the palace, she would instantly be in his hands. At that very moment, the Duke knelt before the Emperor and said that he obeyed his will. The Emperor looked at the young man with fury, but the Duke did not flinch from the intensity of his gaze. The Duke gathered his men at dawn and went to the battlefield, and when the sun rose, the soldiers with the carts headed to the Duke's mansion. The Emperor was very keen to avoid being brought in by force, but he knew that everything was fine because she was in the capital. He understood that as long as Prisepe was within his reach, he could protect her. He turned around because he heard some noise and hoped that the young lady had returned to him, but to his regret, he only saw the knight. He looked at the knight in surprise and asked why he came alone. In turn, the knight trembled with fear because he did not know how to tell the Emperor about everything that had happened. He sighed heavily, and having collected his thoughts, began to explain the entire situation to the Emperor. Recently, by order of the Emperor, they arrived for their mistress at the ducal castle. The knight looked around in surprise, as he did not understand why the area was so quiet. He wondered if the Duke had already gone into the forest. At that very moment, he was taken aback and surprised, and looked to his side as he saw a maid. Hannah approached the young knight with a joyful smile. The Emperor was shocked to hear that the young lady had left at dawn. Trembling with fear, the knight said that everything was exactly like that, and they said that she had gone with the Duke. He was very worried and frightened, but still told the Emperor that they had tried to catch up with them, but they had already left a long time ago, and they unfortunately were unable to catch up with them. At that very moment, the knight presented a small box to the Emperor and said that the Duke had asked you to give him something. At the same time, the young lady was worried because she did not know whether she could do this. Prisepe followed the Duke because she did not want to go to the palace, but she knew that if the Emperor found out about everything, he would go mad. Some time ago, she slowly approached the Duke as she wanted to talk to him. She was worried because it was because of her that he had to go to the battlefield. The Duke looked at her closely and said with tenderness in his voice that she should not frown so. He smiled and said that they were not going to their death, but she was still worried because of her he was in danger, but she did not understand why he was so calm. Prisepe knew that if the Duke went into the forest, she would be sent back to the palace under the pretext of protection, and then everything would go according to the worst-case scenario. The Duke sighed heavily as he saw that she was agitated. He looked at her closely and informed her that the place was a bit harsh for a dress. Prisepe looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. But a moment later, the Duke came very close to her. She froze for a moment, as she did not expect such closeness. The young lady was embarrassed by this, and trembling she called him, but he only threw a shawl over her, and at the same moment asked if she had ever been outside. He looked at her in surprise because she was very embarrassed. Prisepe understood perfectly well that this was even a good opportunity because they had to go to the Forbidden Forest. Precep knew that everything would be fine since the Grand Duke was by her side, but she was a little scared when she heard her words. At that very moment, she threw all her thoughts away as the Duke informed her that he was planning to make a short stop. He asked if she would like to take a short walk. After some time, they were still walking through the forest, but the young lady noticed that they had already entered quite deep into the forest. He sighed heavily and said that they would need to walk more than a day to reach the center of the forest. He turned around and looked at her and asked if she had been able to sleep in the carriage. She sighed heavily and said that she had not been able to do so. Unfortunately, she was very worried. Fenric looked closely at his companion and asked why she was worried. She sighed heavily and said that this was the first time she had left the capital and gone without warning, and so she assumed that the emperor was now furious. Fenric sighed heavily and said that the young lady did not need to worry so much because she had the empire's best bodyguard by her side. She had a hard time with one and said that it seemed like he was always so fearless. Fenric said with a smile that something like this was taught when young men became knights. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he would always be so fearless no matter who his opponent was. At that very moment, the Duke said that, in his own way, it was so. She asked if he would really be fearless when he saw in front of him the killer of the prince and lord. She asked him if he would be fearless, even if there was a man in front of him who threatened him, and it was none other than the emperor himself. He said that it was exactly like that. She turned around in surprise and looked at him intently because she did not understand why he behaved this way. She did not understand why he went so far for her. The Duke, in turn, looked intently at the young league, not knowing what to answer her. But a moment later, he was taken aback as he heard some rustling, and at that very moment, he drew his sword. But after a few seconds, they saw that the forest had simply run past in front of them. The Duke was excited as he saw that it was a harmless animal, but unfortunately, he became more sensitive due to the presence of his mistress. At that moment, he was taken aback as he heard the young lady inform him that she was having difficulty breathing. He quickly walked away from her and, embarrassed, asked for forgiveness. She sighed heavily as she was very embarrassed because he had scared her. She froze for a moment as she realized now how he looked when he was ready for battle. At that very moment, the Duke extended his hand to her with a gentle smile and asked if everything was all right with her. Precep looked at the Duke with bewilderment as he had just had a fierce look. She was confused and did not understand what she was feeling at all. Sometime later, they slowly walked back to the carriage. She was a little puzzled since in all her time in the village in the game, she never once felt a sense of security when someone took care of her. Precep knew that if she had only met a man like the Duke, once she would not have had to suffer so much until now. She sighed heavily because she hoped that he was still a real hero. She knew that would be simply wonderful, and the moment she entered his name, the system notified her that such a person did not exist. She sighed heavily and stood up, that she could not rely on him too much because the Duke was not even mentioned in the search. She understood that he was just a secondary character. Precep was puzzled, but she knew that she had to find the main character herself, and she understood that she should not get attached to him. At the same time, the emperor was sitting in the castle, burning with rage. He was very angry because he asked her to return, and even gave a promise that he would not harm her. He was furious because he did not understand why she trusted the young man, because she knew the Duke better than him. He did not understand why she trusted a man of unknown origin. The emperor was burning with anger, as he knew that he should not have allowed her to move in the first place. Even then, he should have realized that he had his own plans for the young lady. At that very moment, he turned his gaze to the small ball. The maid asked the Duke in surprise if she should really convey something like this to the emperor, since she was confused and did not even know what she was holding in her hands. The Duke said that it was just a video camera. He said that it was a magic stone that recorded what was happening around. He also said that he had several of them for security, and they were originally installed to keep an eye on the young lady and her life. But he didn't expect the stones to be useful in such an unexpected way. At that very moment, the emperor activated the ball and saw Ivan pestering the young lady and saying that it would be better for her to be under his protection. He lustfully said that Precep was a mutant monster and that she would be an excellent subject for research. The emperor saw the young lady screaming and begging him to let her go. At that very moment, he could not bear it any longer, and with fierce rage, he smashed the stone. Now he knew the purpose of the dispatch. He was burning with anger and fury because he understood that the Duke had devised a loophole for himself to retreat. because if he said that this was all for protection from Ivan, he would have nothing to say in response. He was furious because he realized that the young man was trying more and more openly to take the young lady away from him. And now he realized that he was holding a wolf cub next to him. The emperor sighed heavily as he was puzzled, because now he realized that he could not trust anyone. But at that very moment, he looked at the knight with fury and ordered him to immediately bring the great magician Ivan to him, because first he wanted to cut off his impudent hands and then deal with the great duke. That same evening, the duke approached the young lady's tent, shaking himself off as he did so to make himself look more presentable. A few seconds later, he told her that he was coming to see her, but at that very moment, he saw that she was sleeping quietly in bed. He looked at her intently as he realized that the whole day in the carriage had been too tiring for her after all. After some time, he heard something and hurried out of the tent. He slowly approached the steep cliff, and after a few seconds, he told the young man to stop hiding. The young man smiled and told the Grand Duke that he was calling him like a dog. Fenric angrily told the young man to stop following him around. The young man smiled and asked the Duke what he wanted. He noticed that the Duke seemed to have found out that he had recently saved his life. Fenric looked at the young man with fury, as he now realized that he had used his power back then. He smiled and said that now that they were in the forest, it had become much more convenient to resolve matters, because here no one would be surprised if someone died, even if it was the head of the knightly order. Fenric looked sideways at his companion and said that it was so. And besides, it was his homeland. The young man in turn looked at the Duke with a grin, but he did not answer. Fenric sighed heavily and said that this was very surprising, because he knew that Ivan, although he did not look like this was the greatest magician who appeared once in 100 years, and no one could compare with him in pomological power and skill. Fenric thought for a moment as the young man easily overpowered him. The Duke turned around and asked the young man what he was. For a moment there was a dead silence between them. The young man looked at the Duke with a predatory grin and said that he was just a magical creature. He just had a little more mastery of magic than people. The Duke looked at the young man with fury, but did not answer. At the same moment, he suggested that he change the subject. Fenric said that Ivan had recently caused a pogrom in his mansion, and there he had heard something interesting. Looking at the young man, he said that he had heard that magical creatures could recognize each other even if they were half-breeds. The young man looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked what he meant by that. At that very moment, the Duke asked his acquaintance if the young lady had the blood of a magical creature in her. The young man looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if the young lady knew this, as he would like to tell her first. The Duke looked at the young man with a grin and asked if he really thought that, if she recognized her, the answer would change. Fenric looked closely at his companion and said that right now it was just a guess, but soon she would definitely understand everything. At that very moment, the young man's face changed, and with a grin, he said that everything was exactly so, and she was a half-breed, although her parent, a magical creature, had long been dead. He sighed heavily and said that it didn't matter at all whether she knew about it or not. The Duke looked at him in surprise and asked why he was telling him all this. The young man said with a grin that for the allies they started asking questions too late. He looked at the Duke without looking away and said that he simply wanted the imperial house and the entire empire, and indeed the entire world, to be plunged into chaos. He looked hard at the Duke and said he wanted it to be as painful as possible. The Duke asked angrily why he wanted such a thing, because this place, namely the forest, was his homeland, but he took it equally, wanted to turn it into a wasteland. The young man sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that. At that moment, the Duke looked at him with fury, but a moment later, he could not bear it any longer and rushed towards his companion with his faithful sword at the ready. Taken by surprise, he accidentally tripped, and at that very moment began to fall off the cliff. But after a few seconds, he used his magic. Looking at the Duke, he said that this was too much of him. He informed the Duke that falling from such a cliff would tear his body into pieces. The Duke, restraining his rage, looked intently at the young man and asked if this was really the power of an ordinary magical creature. The young man looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that the longer they live, the stronger they become. He sighed heavily and asked the Duke not to consider him such a liar. The Duke was burning with rage as he understood that he could not be trusted. He smiled and suggested that the Duke should not waste his power in vain, since it was he who needed to worry about now, not him. He looked at the Duke intently and said that he should help the others find themselves and kill them because he could do it. He told the Duke that until then he would be on his side. Fenric looked at his companion with fury, for he did not trust him at all. At that very moment, the young people looked intently at the broken camp. The young man looked at the Duke with a satisfied grin and said that he was waiting for him to complete the remaining work. At that very moment, he used his magic and left the Duke alone. Fenric was burning with anger and fury because he understood that the young man was possibly more dangerous than the Emperor or Ivan. He understood that they were now walking the same path. But the Duke in turn understood perfectly well that if the young man became a threat to him or his companion, he would immediately deal with him. After some time, the young man visited the young lady's tent. He approached her and saw that she was sleeping peacefully and serenely. He looked at her intently and leaned closer. But at that very moment, he used his strength and began to strangle her with all his might. Persephone in turn slept quietly, but after this, she began to choke in her sleep. After a few seconds, he finally let her go. He looked closely at the young lady who was sleeping quietly because he knew that it was too early for her to suffer, because her hell was not yet completely ready. He looked at her with a predatory grin, as if he knew that she should sit quietly and still and wait for him. Some time later, Ivan was burning with rage and anger. He could not believe that the lady had left the capital. He was burning with rage because he realized that the Duke had resorted to tricks in order to take her away. Ivan was very angry because he chewed and put all the information into the Emperor's mouth, but he still managed to ruin everything. A moment later, he was taken aback because he saw the Emperor's knights. He looked at them with fury and asked where the Emperor was now. At that very moment, the knights looked at the young man with fury and shouted that he must be detained. The young man shouted to his subordinates to arrest him immediately. Ivan froze in place from shock, as he had not expected such a thing. He looked at the knights in surprise, as he did not understand what was going on at all. Some time later, the knights reported to the Emperor that they had brought Ivan. Ivan shouted angrily at the knights, as he did not understand what they were doing at all. He angrily asked if they knew who he was. Ivan shouted to the Emperor that he must immediately give the order and execute the madmen. He shouted that he was already aware of everything, and they needed to send an army immediately. He shouted that he would personally go to the forest. The Emperor calmly asked the young man why he would do something like that. Ivan was taken aback for a moment and looked at the Emperor in surprise. The Emperor sighed heavily and asked the young man why he was in such a hurry. He told Ivan that there was no reason why the young lady had to return back to the Empire. He hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The Emperor in turn asked the young man if he really wanted to take her case apart piece by piece. The young man became very nervous at that very moment. He did not understand what he was saying to the Emperor. The Emperor in turn looked at the young man with cold fury, but also with calmness, and said that he himself had previously told him that he could protect her instead of the Grand Duke. Ivan froze in shock, and looking at the Emperor wondered where he had learned such a thing. Ivan turned around at that very moment and looked in surprise at the broken magic ball. And now he understood everything. He was burning with anger because he realized that the Duke had set him up. The Emperor looked menacingly at the young man and said that that day he had come uncharacteristically late at night and began to actively crucify himself, which he should have understood. He said that apparently, in Ivan's eyes, he looked quite pathetic, so much so that he had no compunction about planning something like this. Ivan looked at the Emperor with fury, because he knew that in reality he was simply irritated that she did not come to him. He shouted to the Emperor that it was unfair, because now when there was neither a commander of the knights nor a duke, it was he who stood most in defense of the Empire. The Emperor looked at the young man with fury, as he knew that Ivan Toy was a magical talent that the continent really needed, because he was the best. If we compare the strength of individuals, he has the respect of the herbalists. Knowing his value and usefulness, he could allow himself such arrogance. The Emperor knew that Ivan still saw him as that weak young prince, and was mistaken in thinking that he could twist the Emperor's hand as he wanted. The Emperor knew perfectly well that there was no point in creating disorder in the palace surrounded by magicians and knights, and at the same time, he did not want to turn the entire empire against himself. At that very moment, the Emperor told the young man that several hands were not needed to use magic, so he ordered the knights to immediately take Ivan into custody and cut off his left hand. He looked at the young man with cold fury, for he knew what he had to do with him. Ivan was shocked by the Emperor's order. At that very moment, the knights lifted him up and began to lead him out, but he resisted with a cry and at the same time called for the emperor. He was consumed by his rage, insulting every knight and shouting for her to let him out immediately. Some time later, Precep saw the knights and wondered when they arrived at the camp. The Duke sighed heavily and asked the young lady if she was asleep. He said that she should remain in the carriage as he needed to report to the knights, and his subordinate would accompany her while he was not around. Precep was surprised and did not understand where he was going to send her. The Duke immediately announced that she would go to the village near the forest, because inside the forest it was too dangerous, but he still announced that the soldiers would remain in the forest. Precep thought about this village, as she assumed that this is where her mother lived. The Duke looked closely at his subordinate and asked him to take good care of the young lady. At that very moment, they saw the captain of the knights, who was slowly walking towards the Duke. The commander thanked the Duke for coming such a long way, and he also informed the Duke that he was just about to start a meeting. He looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what kind of carriage was behind him. The Duke casually said that there was nothing special about the carriage and asked his subordinate to move out immediately. The Duke assumed that the young man had not yet received a message from the palace. At that very moment, they stared intently at the departing carriage. Some time later, they arrived at the village. The knight told the young lady that the area around the forest was very dangerous, so for a long time, there was only one village in this area. He sighed heavily and said that perhaps Precep would be a little uncomfortable in this village. But Precep smiled and said that everything was fine and he should not worry. At that very moment, Precep looked closely at the surroundings as she realized that her mother lived in this village. She noticed that the village was really small. The knight looked at her intently and asked if she wanted to rest or explore the village. Precep looked at the knight intently and asked if she could walk around the village for a while. He smiled and said that the knights would be on duty inside the forest, and the Duke's personal guard was in the village, so it was safe here, but he still had to accompany her. At that very moment, their dialogue was interrupted as they heard some kind of rumble and saw Madame in front of them. At the same time, Madame was breathing heavily and looking at the lady in surprise. Meanwhile, the knight prepared for the attack. He looked at Madame with anger and asked what she intended to do. Madame was taken aback and said that she had no intention of doing anything like that. She looked intently at Precep and said that she had not seen her for a very long time, and she called her by name. Siegfried looked at the emperor in surprise and asked what he meant, not the monsters, but the Duke. The emperor sighed heavily and said that if all suspicions were true, then the Duke was indeed connected with the monsters. The emperor was completely serious when he said that he would react somehow when meeting monsters, and if the commander noticed something suspicious, he should immediately kill the Duke. Some time later, they were all at our meeting. Siegfried in turn watched the Duke closely. At that very moment, he told them that he would first tell them about the plan. He wanted to split into several groups and examine the forest in sectors. The Duke thought for a moment, as he knew that this idea was not suitable for him, since he intended to kill the captain, and the more witnesses there were, the more difficult it would be for him to cover his tracks. Siegfried said that they needed to do a large-scale investigation this time, so he planned to go even to the deepest parts of the forest. He knew that, to the north of the big tree in the center of the forest, there was the most difficult area where it was full of monsters. He knew that this information was only mentioned in historical records, but he wanted to check everything, since it was assumed that there would be a key to the emergence of monsters. He also reported that there was a lake to the east, and there was a main path nearby that led to the village, but it had long been blocked, so there was simply no need to worry about it. He also reported a key to an alien zone, in the center of which there was a cave, and the locals called it the Cave of Silence. And unfortunately, little was known about it. But he knew that there was an incredible magical power concentrated there, and that there were monsters there that they could not meet on the outskirts of the forest. Siegfried, looking at the map, said that judging by the location and conditions, this structure was later someone's shelter. The Duke sighed heavily, and looking at the map, said that it all resembled the Demon Lord. The captain agreed with him heavily and said that he didn't know if he really existed, as legends said about him a lot, but they needed to check everything thoroughly.